She had been working at Halverson Military Medical Center for 4 months before anyone noticed the tattoos. 5 of them, running along the inside of her left forearm in a vertical line, each one a deep violet, each one shaped like a thin crescent, like something had cut there and been marked afterward on purpose. The night a helicopter went down 30 miles outside Delvane and the casualties started rolling in, a soldier on the second gurney grabbed her wrist mid-procedure, stared at those marks, and stopped breathing for a full 3 seconds. Then he said a name. Not nurse, not hey, but a specific call sign that no civilian would have known, spoken in the kind of voice men use when they see something they were told no longer existed. The entire trauma bay heard it, and nothing at Halverson was ever the same again. If you've made it this far, I want you to stay with me until the end of this story, because what happens to this woman is going to hit different than anything you've seen on this channel. Hit like, drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to see how far this story travels. Elena Ward took the job at Halverson because it was the only offer that didn't ask too many questions. That was the honest version, the one she didn't say out loud. The version she gave to HR was simpler. She was relocating after a few years abroad, she had her nursing license and certifications in order, and she was looking for a position in a high-volume trauma environment. All true, all incomplete. Halverson Military Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Delvane, a mid-sized city that existed primarily because the Kelman Air Base existed first. The hospital was the kind of place that had 2 different clocks on the trauma bay wall, one for local time, one for whatever theater the current conflict was operating in. It served active duty personnel, veterans, contractors, and the occasional civilian who had the misfortune of living close enough to base infrastructure to get caught in someone else's emergency. Elena reported to the nursing floor on a Tuesday in March, wearing clean scrubs, a plain watch, and a single stud in each ear. She looked like exactly what her paperwork said she was. A 31-year-old registered nurse with solid credentials, calm demeanor, and nothing remarkable about her that would make anyone look twice. Which was precisely the point. The charge nurse who processed her intake was a woman named Dorothea Rask, early 50s, built like someone who had worked nights for 2 decades and considered softness a professional liability. Dorothea looked at Elena's file, looked at Elena, and made the assessment in about 4 seconds. You've got trauma certifications but no hospital experience in the last 3 years. That's a gap. I worked in field medicine. It's listed in the secondary documentation. Field medicine. Dorothea repeated it the way people repeat things they're filing under not relevant. This isn't a tent ward. We run 30 to 50 critical cases a week. The physicians here expect their nursing staff to keep pace. If you're not comfortable at that tempo, better to say so now. I'm comfortable, Elena said. Dorothea handed her a badge and a floor assignment and moved on to the next thing on her desk. The conversation was over. Elena had been assessed and categorized and shelved, and she understood that was exactly how it would go. She had expected it. She clipped the badge to her scrubs and found her way to the trauma floor without asking for directions. The surgeon who became her primary problem was named Marcus Vale. He was 44 years old, board-certified in trauma surgery, and accustomed to a particular operating order, one in which his assessments were correct, his decisions were final, and the nursing staff existed to execute rather than evaluate. He had a reputation for results, which meant he also had a reputation for behavior that HR had documented and declined to address. 3 nurses had transferred out of his rotation in the past year. Nobody said it plainly, but everyone understood why. Elena met him on her 3rd shift, during a chest trauma case that came in from a vehicle accident on the base access road. She was assisting when she noticed the patient's oxygen saturation beginning to trend in the wrong direction. Not dramatically, not yet, but the pattern was there if you knew what pattern to look for. She said, "His SAT's dropping. I'd want to check for tension pneumo before we—" "I didn't ask you," Vale said, without looking up. "I understand. I'm flagging it." "You've been here 3 days, Ward. Flag things you're qualified to flag." She was quiet for 11 seconds. The saturation dropped another 2 points. Then she said, quietly and without inflection, "If it's tension pneumo and we don't decompress now, we're going to lose him before he's prepped." Vale looked at the monitor, looked at the patient, made the call to decompress, which was the right call, and which he made in a way that suggested it had been his idea from the start. The patient stabilized. Afterward, in the corridor, he stopped beside her. "You got lucky with a guess," he said. "Okay," Elena said. "In this department, luck isn't a methodology. You keep second-guessing the attending physicians, I'll have you reassigned to general floor." She met his eyes. "That would be your call to make." He stared at her for a moment, something in his expression shifting, like he'd expected pushback and didn't know what to do with the absence of it. Then he walked away. Elena went back to her station, updated her patient notes, and said nothing to anyone about what had happened. She had learned a long time ago that the moment you explain yourself is the moment you've already lost ground. So she didn't explain. She worked. The hospital had its own social architecture, the way all closed institutions do. Alliances, hierarchies, grudges, running 3 years deep, the kind of internal politics that look petty from the outside but feel consequential when you're inside them every day. Elena navigated it by staying outside it. She ate lunch alone or with patients. She didn't join the group texts that circulated among the nursing staff. She wasn't cold. She answered when spoken to, helped when asked, remembered the preferences and patterns of the patients she worked with in a way that made her effective without making her visible. But that kind of quiet draws its own attention. A nurse named Petra Gans, who had been at Halverson 6 years and operated as the unofficial social center of the floor, decided early that Elena's self-sufficiency was actually arrogance, that she thought she was better, that the quiet was a kind of superiority she hadn't earned. "She doesn't say much," Petra said to another nurse one afternoon, not quietly enough. "But you can tell she thinks she knows more than everyone else." Elena, 3 feet away at the medication cart, continued counting vials and said nothing. The small humiliations accumulated in the way they always do, not as dramatic confrontations, but as 100 small dismissals. Her chart notes were questioned by residents who were less experienced than she was. During team briefings, her observations were acknowledged and then ignored. One afternoon, a doctor named Suraj Fen interrupted her mid-sentence during a patient handoff and spent 4 minutes explaining a concept she had known for years, addressing his explanation to the male nurse standing beside her. She let it happen. She let all of it happen. Not because she was passive, not because she didn't notice, but because the things she had survived before this were of a magnitude that made Halverson's small cruelties feel like weather. Unpleasant, not permanent, not the point. The point was the patients. It had always been the patients. The tattoos got their first real attention in week 6. She was in the break room, rolling her sleeve up slightly to reach something in her bag, when a traveling nurse named Kyle Moran caught sight of the marks and made a face that was somewhere between curious and alarmed. "What are those?" "Old injuries," Elena said. "All 5 of them?" "One per incident." He stared for a moment. "What kind of field medicine exactly?" "The kind with bad weather and no backup," she said, and zipped her bag. He brought it up twice more over the following weeks, in increasingly pointed ways, the way people do when they've convinced themselves they're entitled to an explanation. Elena gave him nothing each time. Eventually he moved on, but the question had been seeded, and in a place like Halverson, where people had more institutional loyalty than civilian hospitals, but more curiosity than military installations, seeds grew fast. Vale heard about the tattoos through the informal channel. He mentioned it during a department meeting in a way that was designed to sound casual. "Ward, I heard you have some kind of medical markings on your arm. For the record, any tattoos that could be misread by patients or families, they're covered by my uniform," Elena said. "Compliance isn't an issue." "I wasn't suggesting a compliance issue. I was making an observation." "Noted," Elena said. Vale looked at her across the table, and the look said, "I'm going to find a way to get you off this floor." And Elena looked back, and her look said nothing, because she had stopped conducting arguments with her face a long time ago. The first genuine crisis arrived on a Wednesday night, 63 days into her posting. A National Guard convoy had run into a roadside situation during a training exercise 40 miles out. The official language was already in use before anyone knew the full picture, and the injured were incoming. 4 confirmed, possibly 6, severity unknown. Halverson's trauma team activated. What nobody had anticipated was that 2 of Halverson's senior trauma nurses were out sick. Another was stuck in a procedure that couldn't be interrupted, and the ER charge on duty that night, a capable but relatively junior nurse named Dario Neff, had never run a mass casualty activation on his own. Elena was in the middle of a patient check when the alert came through. She finished the check, handed off cleanly, and moved toward trauma without being asked. The next 45 minutes were organized chaos. 6 casualties came in across 3 vehicle transports. Injuries ranging from fractures and lacerations to one patient with abdominal trauma and deteriorating vitals. Dario was doing his best, which was not enough, because his best was being distributed across 6 situations simultaneously, and nobody had yet established which 5 were less urgent than the one that was actively dying. Elena assessed the room in about 8 seconds. She wasn't supposed to be running anything. She was 4 months into a civilian nursing post and not the charge on duty. But nobody else was doing what needed to be done, so she did it. "Dario," she said, moving to stand beside him. "Bed 2 has a tension pneumo developing and is your highest priority. Send Fenn's resident to stabilize Bed 4. The fracture is bad, but it's stable blood pressure. Beds 1, 3, and 5 can hold for 90 seconds while you get eyes on 2. He looked at her. "How do you trust it or don't?" she said, "but decide now." He trusted it. He moved to Bed 2. She coordinated the rest, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, efficiently, in the voice of someone who had done this in far worse conditions and was not impressed by the chaos because the chaos was the baseline she was designed for. She repositioned staff, called for specific equipment before the physicians requested it, caught a medication dosing error that would have been serious, and identified a spinal concern in patient 6 that the admitting doctor had not yet flagged. It took 20 minutes before Vale arrived. He walked into a trauma bay that was controlled, organized, and moving, and stood at the entrance looking at a scene that had clearly been operating without him. He watched Elena for a long moment. Then he walked to the nearest available resident and said, loudly enough for half the room to hear, "Who authorized Ward to direct this response?" The resident blinked. "Sir, she was—" "I didn't ask what she was doing. I asked who authorized it." Elena didn't stop moving. She finished documenting the medication correction, handed the file to the attending, and then straightened and looked at Vale. "Patient 2 needs the thoracic tray in the next 4 minutes," she said. "I can tell you who authorized what after." Vale stared at her. She turned back to patient 2. He said nothing for 9 seconds, the longest 9 seconds in the room, and then he called for the tray. All 6 patients survived that night. It wasn't the record that mattered. It was the margin. The margin was a lot thinner than Halverson liked to acknowledge, and Elena was the reason the margin existed, but that wasn't what Vale documented in his incident report. The report went to the department director, a man named Aldous Karras, who had been at Halverson for 22 years and understood institutional territory the way old trees understand water, by root, not by thought. Vale's report characterized Elena's actions as unauthorized assumption of charge responsibilities, disruptive to established protocol, and potentially dangerous given the nurse's limited experience in this facility. Karras called Elena into his office the following morning. He was not unkind about it. That was the thing about Karras. He had a way of delivering bad news in a tone that sounded reasonable, which made the bad news feel like it was your fault for not seeing it coming. "You showed initiative," he said. "I understand that. And from what I'm hearing, the response went well. But we have structures here, Ward. We have protocols about who directs what and when. You stepped outside those structures. There was no one inside those structures capable of running the situation at that moment. That's not your assessment to make." She was quiet for a moment. "With respect, it's exactly my assessment to make when patient lives are the alternative." Karras leaned back. "I'm going to ask you to stick to your assigned responsibilities. If there's a future activation that requires charge-level coordination, your role is to support the designated charge, not to replace them. And if the designated charge is underwater, you flag it to the attending." "I did flag it," Elena said, "to the attending who was occupied with patient 2 and needed me to handle the floor while he worked." Karras looked at her for a long time. "I'm going to put a performance note in your file," he said. "Nothing that affects your position. But I need it documented that we had this conversation." Elena looked at him. "You're documenting that I kept 6 patients alive. I'm documenting that you exceeded your authorized scope." He said it gently. Gently enough that it almost didn't sound like what it was. She left his office, stood in the corridor for a moment, and took a breath. She had been here before. Not this office, not this hospital, but this particular version of institutional reality. The place where doing the right thing gets you paperwork instead of acknowledgement, where competence is punished when it makes the wrong person visible. She had been here before, and she had survived worse versions of it. She went back to work. 3 weeks after the incident report, Vale made his move. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't intended to be. He compiled a document, specific cases where Elena had deviated from standard nursing protocol, each one documented with clinical language designed to make good judgment sound like recklessness. He brought it to Karis. Karis brought it to the nursing director, a woman named Hazel Pond, who ran the department with the efficiency of someone who had stopped finding conflict interesting years ago. Hazel called Elena in on a Thursday afternoon. "We're looking at a reassignment," Hazel said, "moving you from trauma to general medical. It's not a termination, and it's not a formal disciplinary action. It's a placement decision based on scope alignment." Elena heard every word under those words. "Who initiated the review?" she asked. "It came through the standard performance pathway." "Did it?" Hazel looked at her, something that was almost sympathy, the kind people allow themselves when they've already made a decision and don't want to feel bad about it. "This doesn't have to be contentious, Ward. General medical is important work. You'd be good at it." "I'd be better in trauma," Elena said, "and so would your patients." "That's not the assessment we're working with." Elena was quiet. Then she said, "When does the reassignment take effect?" 2 weeks. She nodded. She stood up. She was at the door when Hazel said, "I'm sorry about this. For what it's worth." Elena looked back. "It's worth something," she said. Then she left. She did not cry in the corridor. She did not go to the break room and vent to a colleague. She walked to the supply closet at the end of the hall, stood inside it for 90 seconds in the dark, and put everything back where it belonged inside her chest. Then she came out, found her patient list, and worked her shift. The storm that ended everything started as weather. 11 days before her reassignment was scheduled to take effect, a severe system pushed in from the coast and grounded aircraft across the region. Base communications were degraded. Roads in the eastern corridor flooded in under 2 hours. And at 11:47 p.m., a military transport helicopter with 7 personnel aboard went down in a ravine 12 miles from the Kelman base perimeter. The call came into Halverson at 11:52. By midnight, the trauma bay was activating for what the base liaison was calling a Class 2 mass casualty event. Multiple critical patients, complex injuries, incoming on ground transport because the weather had made air support impossible. The timeline was 40 to 50 minutes for first arrivals. Halverson's on-call trauma attending that night was a doctor named Suraj Fen. He was competent. He was also 3 procedures into a night that had already been brutal, and he was managing the incoming activation while simultaneously trying to hand off a post-surgical patient whose vitals were doing something concerning. Petra Gans was the charge nurse on duty. Petra had done this job for 6 years and was good at it in ordinary circumstances. These were not ordinary circumstances. She began assigning stations, reading the incoming report, coordinating with the base liaison. And somewhere in those first 12 minutes of activation, the complexity exceeded the bandwidth she had available, and the gaps started opening. Elena was finishing a charting task at the nurses' station when she heard Petra's voice pitch up slightly on the 3rd radio call with the transport team. She listened to the exchange. She heard the lieutenant on the other end describe injuries that the activation plan wasn't accounting for correctly. She stood up. She walked to the supply room first because she already knew what she would need, and she was not willing to be caught without it. She pulled traction splints, chest seals, pressure dressings, a cricothyrotomy kit that hadn't been restocked after the last use. She brought all of it to Trauma Bay and set it up at the secondary station without announcing what she was doing. Dario saw her and came over. "Petra's got the activation." "I know," Elena said. "You're not supposed to be—" "I know," she said again. "Help me set this up." He looked at the supplies. He looked at her face. He helped her set it up. The first transport arrived at 12:41 a.m., carrying 2 casualties, a sergeant with blast pattern injuries to the lower extremities, and a specialist with a chest wound that had been partially treated in the field and was now compensating in ways that were about to stop compensating. Petra's team moved to receive them. The second transport arrived 6 minutes later. Then the third. 7 patients total, 3 critical. The trauma bay that had been activated for a mass casualty event was receiving exactly what it had been told to expect, but the real injuries were more complex than the field reports had indicated, which was always the case, and which the people who had never worked field medicine sometimes forgot to plan for. Petra was calling assignments and getting behind. The math didn't work. Too many critical patients, too few hands that knew what to do with the specific presentation of blast injury and field-treated wounds. Elena had already moved to patient 4 before anyone told her to. She was mid-assessment, finding a tension pneumo that had been missed in transport, the same pattern she'd flagged her first week, when Fenn looked over from patient 2 and registered what was happening. "Ward, who authorized you to—" "Tension pneumo, patient 4, she said without looking up. "He's got maybe 3 minutes before it's a cardiac event. I need thoracic needle decompression, and I need it now." Fenn stared for half a second. Then he moved. He performed the decompression. Elena had the equipment in his hand before he finished the sentence, requesting it. Patient 4 stabilized in 90 seconds. That was when the soldier on Gurney 2, the sergeant with blast injuries, the one whose partner had just been stabilized, grabbed Elena's wrist as she moved past. He was conscious, barely. His grip was weak but purposeful. She stopped and looked at him. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her forearm, where her sleeve had ridden up past the edge of her glove during the physical work. 5 violet crescents, visible under the trauma bay lighting. The sergeant's mouth moved. His voice was barely a sound. "Ghost actual," he said. "You're ghost actual." The room didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet in pieces. One person stopping, then another, then Fenn mid-sentence, then Petra mid-step, until the only sounds were the monitors and the storm hammering the building from outside. Elena looked at the sergeant. Her expression was completely level. She said quietly, "You need to stay still. Your BP is low and I need you to let me work." "I saw those tattoos in a briefing," he said. "Classified OP report, Kassala Province, 2019. The name hit the room like a pressure wave. Elena held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she said again, with the same absolute calm, "Let me work." She turned back to her assessment. Her hands were steady. Her face was steady. She completed the evaluation, called the imaging order, documented the vitals. But the room had cracked open. Everyone who had heard the sergeant speak was standing in a different version of the hospital than the one they'd been in 60 seconds before, holding a very different understanding of the woman they'd dismissed for 4 months, and nobody yet knew what to do with it. Outside, the storm hammered the windows. Inside, 7 soldiers needed to be kept alive, and Elena Ward did not stop moving. She didn't look at anyone when she turned away from the sergeant. That was the discipline of it, knowing that the moment you acknowledge the weight of a room is the moment the room wins. And Elena Ward had not survived what she survived by letting rooms win. Patient 5 was a lieutenant with femoral bleeding that the field tourniquet had slowed but not stopped. She assessed the entry point, checked the tourniquet placement, found it 2 inches too low, and repositioned it with the efficient economy of someone who had done this in the dark, in the rain, with people shooting in the near distance. 23 seconds from assessment to correction. The lieutenant's blood pressure began stabilizing within 2 minutes. She moved to patient 6. Behind her, she could hear the room recalibrating, not dramatically. There was no time for dramatic. But the quality of the silence between instructions had changed. Dario was moving faster now, anticipating rather than reacting. Even Petra, who had been running behind the whole activation, seemed to have steadied, as if the sergeant's words had done something structural to the atmosphere of the room that she was benefiting from without knowing why. Patient 6 had a traumatic brain injury pattern. Unequal pupils, slowing respiratory rate, the beginning of a Cushing's response. She flagged it for Fenn with 3 words. 6 needs neurosurg. Fenn was already moving. The storm outside was worsening. At some point in the last hour, one of the corridor windows had developed a leak, and there was water spreading across the floor of the hallway in a thin sheet that the maintenance crew hadn't reached yet. An orderly had put a wet floor sign at the edge of the trauma bay entrance, which seemed like an absurd piece of bureaucracy, given what was happening inside. Patient 7 came off the last transport at 1:09 a.m. a combat medic with a penetrating shoulder wound and a secondary injury to the neck that the transport team hadn't flagged in their handoff report. Elena caught it during intake. She was already calling the vascular surgeon on call before the admitting resident had finished his initial assessment. "How did you know?" the resident asked. He was 28 years old and had been awake for 18 hours and was past the point of professional performance and into the place where honest questions just fell out. "Presentation," she said. "Neck asymmetry, deviation, accessory muscle use. He's compensating for venous compromise." The field team didn't note any of that. "Field teams are doing 6 things at once in the dark," she said. "They note what they can." She said it without judgment because she had been a field team, and she understood exactly what those conditions produced and what they didn't. By 2:30 a.m., all 7 patients were either in surgery, stabilized in trauma bays, or being transferred to the ICU. The activation was technically complete. Fenn found Elena at the documentation station, charting with the same focused quiet she brought to every task. Like the work itself was the point, not the drama around it. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. She continued charting. "The neck injury on 7, he finally said. "If you hadn't flagged that during intake, he'd have been fine for about 40 more minutes," she said. "And then not." Fenn was quiet. Then, Kassala Province. She didn't look up from the chart. "I don't know what the sergeant was referring to," he said, "in the way people say things when they're giving you a chance to say something different. But whatever it is, it changed the way every person in that room was operating for the last 90 minutes. "The patients are stable," Elena said. "That's what matters." "Ward." She looked up. He held her gaze for a moment, a different kind of look than she'd gotten from him before. Not the distracted half-attention of an attending addressing a nurse. Something more careful. "We were going to reassign you to General Medical. I'm aware. That..." He stopped, started again. "I'm going to have to think about whether that's still the right decision." "That's your call to make," she said. The same word she'd used with Vale 4 months ago. She turned back to the chart. Fenn left without saying anything else. She finished the documentation and went to get a cup of coffee, which tasted like it had been sitting in the pot for 6 hours, which it probably had, and drank it anyway. The sergeant's name was Harlan Oates. She checked his chart after she'd cleared her other documentation, not because she needed his name to treat him, but because she had flagged his status for follow-up, and it was clinical procedure to review the record. He was 34, 12 years of service. 3 deployments. His emergency contact was a woman in Portland, listed as sister. She closed the chart and went to check on him at 3:15 a.m. He was in Bay 3, stabilized, attached to a monitor and an IV, his lower extremities in temporary immobilization, waiting for orthopedic review at first light. He was not supposed to be conscious. He was conscious. "You're supposed to be sedated," she said, checking his IV line. "I metabolize it fast," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Always have." She noted his vitals on the tablet. "You need to rest. I need to ask you something." "Oates." "Just one question." She finished the vitals notation, looked at him. He looked back. He had the kind of face that had been ordinary once and had been rearranged by experience into something harder to read. Not mean, not damaged in the obvious way, but marked. The way people get marked when they've seen specific things. "Go ahead," she said. "Were you there?" "At Kassala. The forward operating base evacuation." She was quiet for 4 seconds. Not because she was deciding whether to lie. She wasn't going to lie. She had stopped lying about that particular history 2 years ago. But because saying yes for the first time in a long time to someone who had access to the context required a specific kind of composure that she needed a moment to locate. "Yes," she said. Harlan Oates closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet at the edges, and he didn't do anything to address that. "I was in the unit that went in after, the recovery operation. We were briefed on what happened, on what the combat medic, on what Ghost Actual did to get those people out." "It's a call sign," she said. "Not a thing." 14 soldiers, he said. 14, and only 3 went in with injuries. The rest of them walked out. His jaw worked. "They said Ghost Actual was KIA. That's what the report said." "The report was wrong," she said. "Clearly." He looked at her forearm, at the sleeve covering the tattoos. 5? 5 separate engagement injuries. I marked them myself when I got out. Why? She thought about how to answer that. The real answer was complicated and involved a period of about 14 months. She didn't particularly want to revisit. The simple answer was close enough to the real one that it would do. So I wouldn't forget what it cost, she said. Harlan nodded. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then, the people in this hospital, they've been treating you like a new nurse, she said, which is what I am here, which is what I wanted to be. Is that working out? She almost smiled. Almost. Less and less. Halverson at 4 a.m. had the particular quality of places that are supposed to be quiet, but have too many things running to ever fully achieve it. Ventilators cycling, monitors beeping in varied rhythms, the low murmur of the overnight staff communicating in the careful tones of people trying not to disturb anyone while keeping every necessary system operational. Elena walked her rounds, checked her assigned patients, and arrived back at the nursing station to find Petra Gans sitting there. Petra looked tired. She also looked like someone who was working through something internally and hadn't finished. You repositioned the tourniquet on patient 5 before Fenn got to him, Petra said. It was placed wrong. How did you know where to look? Elena sat down across from her. The break room clock said 4:07. Outside the window, the storm was easing, the kind of slow withdrawal that storms do in the middle of the night, pulling back before anyone is awake enough to notice. I've seen that injury before, Elena said. The pattern of it. In field medicine. Yes. Petra looked at her hands. She wasn't a malicious person. Elena had always been able to see that, even through the friction. She was a person who had built a sense of order around herself and treated disruptions to that order as threats, which made her difficult but not unkind. The sergeant said Kassala province. He was confused, Elena said. He lost a lot of blood. Petra looked up. He didn't sound confused. Elena said nothing. I told people you were arrogant, Petra said. I said that to a few people, that you acted like you knew more than everyone. Okay. I don't know if it's an apology exactly. I don't know what it is. You don't need to know right now, Elena said. Get some sleep when your shift ends. Petra nodded. She stood up, moved to leave, then stopped. The tattoos, the 5 marks. Old injuries. From Kassala? A beat. From before and during. Petra nodded again, slowly, like the nod was the beginning of a longer process. She left. Elena sat alone at the nursing station for 6 minutes. She watched the monitors. She drank the last of the terrible coffee. She thought about how this was the thing about staying small. Eventually something happened that was too large for the small version of you to contain, and then you had to deal with the aftermath of everyone recalibrating. She didn't want to deal with the aftermath. She wanted to do her job. She was running out of time in which those two things were going to be compatible. At 7:15 a.m., 4 vehicles with government plates arrived in the Halverson parking structure. Elena didn't see them arrive. She was handling a post-procedure check on patient 2 when the convoy pulled in, and she had no way of knowing that the tall woman who stepped out of the second vehicle and showed a credential to the security desk downstairs would rewrite the next 6 hours of her life. She found out when Aldous Karras appeared in the trauma bay at 7:40 a.m. with an expression that Elena had never seen on his face before. Not the careful, administrative version of concern he usually deployed, but something rawer. Something that looked like a man who had just been told that the ground he'd been standing on was a different shape than he thought. Ward, he said, there's someone here who needs to speak with you. I have 2 patients who need morning check-ins. Dario can cover them. He paused. Please. She looked at him. In 4 months at Halverson, Aldous Karras had never said please to her. She set down the tablet and followed him. Volte. The woman waiting in the conference room on the second floor was named Brigadier General Sable Okafor, and she was not what Elena had expected, which was itself evidence that Elena had been expecting something. Okafor was 51, compact, with close-cropped hair, and the bearing of someone who had stopped performing authority years ago because she no longer needed to perform it. She was in civilian clothes, a dark blazer, simple slacks, but the credential badge on the table in front of her said enough. There were 2 other people in the room. A man in his 40s who was introduced as Special Investigator Reed from the Defense Oversight Division, and a woman with a laptop who was introduced only as my aide and who appeared to be there primarily to document. Elena sat across from Okafor. "You're harder to find than I expected," Okafor said. "I've been looking for you for about 14 months. "I wasn't hiding," Elena said. "No, you just changed your name, your location, your specialty designation, and filed for a civilian nursing license under a different state than your last deployment posting." Okafor's expression was dry, not accusatory. "That's not hiding. That's very thorough restructuring. I wanted a quiet life." "You picked a military hospital for your quiet life." "I know how these places work," Elena said. "Civilian hospitals were—" "I didn't know the language well enough, the rhythms." Okafor studied her for a moment. "Elena Ward is your mother's maiden name." "Yes." "Your service record is under Elena Marin Vasquez, Captain, 7th Special Operations Support Command, attached to JSOC Medical Operations from 2017 to 2022. Okafor paused. "Decorated, specifically for Kassala Province, Operation Forward Tide, in March of 2021. Elena didn't say anything. "The after-action report for that operation listed you as missing, presumed killed. Your team reported you were behind when the secondary structure came down." "I wasn't." "We know that now." Okafor leaned forward slightly. 14 soldiers came out of that FOB evacuation alive, Captain. 14. The 3 who went in injured went in critical and came out stable. The medical protocols you implemented in the field under active engagement, in an environment with zero infrastructure, degraded communications, and an incoming enemy element, are still being studied at the Army Medical Department. The room was quiet. The aide's laptop made tiny sounds. "I didn't implement protocols," Elena said. "I improvised. There's a difference." "The Army disagrees. The distinction between sophisticated improvisation and protocol is mostly semantic when the outcome is 14 survivors." Okafor sat back. "You went off record, resigned your commission through a backdoor administrative channel. You gave a forwarding address that you never lived at." "I needed to leave." "I understand that." And the way she said it suggested she actually did, not as a formality, but as someone who had seen people reach the end of what they could carry and make decisions accordingly. "I'm not here to bring you back into service. That's not what this is." "Then what is this?" "This," Okafor said, "is what happens when Sergeant Harlan Oates regains consciousness and asks for a secure phone at 4 a.m. and calls a number that goes directly to my office." She let that sit for a moment. "He told me what he saw in this hospital, what he heard about how you've been treated." Elena's jaw tightened slightly, the first tell she'd shown in the entire conversation. "He shouldn't have called," she said. "He did what soldiers do when they see someone who saved lives being treated like a problem," Okafor said. "He reported it up the chain. I'm a civilian. You have a service record that doesn't stop being real because you filed different paperwork." Okafor picked up the credential badge and turned it over in her hand. "We also, separately from Oates, had a complaint filed with the Defense Medical Oversight Division regarding treatment of contracted medical personnel at this facility. 2 complaints, actually, filed over the last 30 days by staff members who found the internal process inadequate." Elena blinked. She hadn't known that. She genuinely hadn't known that. "Who filed them?" she asked. "That's confidential during the review period." Okafor set the badge down. "What I can tell you is that an oversight review of this hospital's clinical decision-making and personnel management has been formally opened, which means that everything that happened in this building for the past 4 months, specifically regarding your posting, is now a federal matter." The word federal landed in the room with its full weight. "I didn't ask for any of this," Elena said. "I know," Okafor said. "The people who have it coming rarely do things to people who ask for it. That's not how it works." She held Elena's gaze. "I need you to answer some questions on record, about your service history, about the events of last night, and about what you've experienced at this facility since your arrival. You can have representation present if you want it." "I don't need representation." "Captain." "Ward," Elena said. "I'm Ward now." Okafor looked at her for a long moment. Something in her expression adjusted, not softening exactly, but recognizing, like she understood the weight of the correction and respected it enough not to argue. "Ward," she said, "I need to ask you one thing before we go on record, and it's not an official question." Elena waited. 4 months, Okafor said. You've been here 4 months, and from what I'm reading in the complaint documentation and the overnight incident reports, the treatment you've received has been, let's say it's been well below what someone with your record should have experienced anywhere. She paused. Why didn't you go? Elena was quiet for a moment. Because the patients needed someone who knew what they were doing, she said, and I knew what I was doing. Okafor held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she opened the folder on the table and clicked a small recorder to the active position. Let's go on record, she said. Downstairs in the trauma bay, Marcus Vale had arrived for his morning shift at 7:30 and been informed by the charge on duty that there were representatives from Defense Medical Oversight in the building. He had taken this information with the professional composure of someone who immediately began reviewing in his mind everything he'd ever put in writing about Elena Ward. There was quite a bit to review. He went to Karras's office and found Karras sitting behind his desk, looking at his screen with the expression of a man who had realized, too late, that the documentation trail he thought protected him was actually a very clear record of exactly what had happened. How much did they see? Vale said. Karras looked up. Everything that was submitted to Central Records, which includes your incident report, and mine. Those reports were accurate characterizations of. They were submitted after a nurse with a classified military service record prevented at least 2 patient deaths last night, Karras said. His voice was flat, empty of the careful administrative reasonableness he usually deployed. And they document, in our own words, a 4-month pattern of restricting her clinical authority. He paused. The oversight team asked me this morning who authorized the reassignment to General Medical. Vale was quiet. I told them it came through standard performance review, Karras said, which is true. And I told them the review was initiated by the trauma department lead. He looked at Vale, which is also true. The 2 men looked at each other. What passed between them in that moment was not a strategy discussion, because there was no longer a strategy. There was only the question of how much damage each of them would take, and whether it was possible to shape the damage so it landed differently. And in that particular calculation, Karras and Vale were not natural allies, because the documentation showed very clearly who had initiated the review and who had signed the performance note. Karras looked back at his screen. I think you should speak to hospital legal, he said, before you say anything else to anyone in this building. Vale stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he left. The hallway was quiet. Most of the day staff hadn't fully arrived yet. The cleaners were running a buffer over the corridor floors, and the sound of it filled the spaces where the usual noise of the hospital would be. In the conference room on the 2nd floor, Elena was answering Brigadier General Okafor's questions in a steady, unhurried voice, laying out 4 months of experience in a military hospital in a way that was factual, specific, and utterly devastating in its neutrality. Not because she was trying to destroy anyone, because she had been asked for the truth, and she was giving it. And somewhere in the ICU, Harlan Oates was sleeping at last, his vitals stable, his breathing even, his hand resting on the blanket in a loose curl, looking, in that particular suspended state, like exactly what he was, a soldier who had done the one thing available to him, and was resting now because there was nothing left to do but wait for the people he'd reported to do their jobs. Outside, the storm had passed completely. The sky over Del Valle was clearing in the east, going from dark to the particular pale gray that comes before actual light. Not dawn yet, but the specific moment when dawn becomes inevitable. And in the parking structure, a 3rd vehicle with government plates was pulling in. This one was different from the others. The man who stepped out of it was in uniform, wearing the insignia of a colonel in the Army Medical Corps, and he was carrying a sealed file that had been hand-delivered to his office at 5 a.m. by courier. He spoke briefly to the security desk. The desk called upstairs. The call was redirected. 2 minutes later, Brigadier General Okafor's aide knocked on the conference room door, opened it slightly, and said 2 words to Okafor in a voice too low for Elena to hear. Okafor's expression changed. It was the first time in the entire conversation that Elena had seen something she hadn't expected cross the general's face. Not alarm, something more like recognition. The look of someone who has been tracking a thing from a distance and has just watched it arrive. Okafor looked at Elena. We're going to need to pause the interview, she said. Why? Because, Okafor said carefully, someone just arrived who knows more about your service record than I do, and I think you need to be in the room when he speaks. Elena held her expression steady. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. But something in the way Okafor said it, in the particular weight of the words, made the back of her neck prickle in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "Who is it?" Elena asked. Okafor looked at her for one long moment before she answered. "His name is Colonel Dax Merritt," she said. "And 6 years ago, he was the commanding officer of the unit you pulled 14 people out of." Elena didn't move for a moment. The name landed differently than she had expected, not as a shock, because she had trained herself out of shock years ago, but as something more visceral, a physical response that had nothing to do with her training and everything to do with the 6 years of distance she had put between herself and that name, that operation, that particular ravine outside Kassala where the secondary structure came down, and she had made a decision that cost her everything she thought she was. She stood up. "I'll meet him," she said. Okafor nodded, and her aide opened the door. The corridor outside the conference room was ordinary in every way that corridors are ordinary. Linoleum, fluorescent light, the smell of antiseptic, and recycled air. Halverson's second floor was administrative, quieter than the clinical floors, and at this hour it was nearly empty. Elena walked it at her usual pace, which was not slow and not hurried, and she kept her hands loose at her sides and her face arranged in the expression she had learned to use for situations that required everything she had without showing any of it. Colonel Dax Merritt was standing at the end of the hall near the window that overlooked the parking structure. He was 53, gray at the temples, and had the posture of someone who had spent a long time in the field and never fully transitioned out of it even after the desk job arrived. He was holding the sealed file in his left hand. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was waiting the way people wait when they've learned that waiting is an active thing. He saw her when she was about 15 feet away. His expression changed, not dramatically, but she caught it. The fractional adjustment of someone who had been carrying a version of this moment in their head for 6 years and was now measuring the real version against it. She stopped in front of him. For 3 seconds, neither of them said anything. Then he said, "You look different." "I'm not different," she said. "No." He considered that. "No, you're not." He glanced down at the file in his hand, then back at her. "I owe you an explanation before we go back in that room." "You don't owe me anything, Colonel." "Dax," he said, "you've earned the right to use my name." She looked at him steadily. "What's in the file?" He held it out. She took it. It was sealed with a red evidence strip, the kind used for official documentation in contested investigations. She broke the strip and opened it. The first page was a cover letter from the Inspector General of the Army Medical Command. The second page was an executive summary of a 6-year-old inquiry that had been conducted, concluded, and filed, and then quietly reopened 18 months ago when a procedural audit flagged an anomaly in the original after-action reporting for Operation Forward Tide. She read it carefully. The corridor was quiet. Merritt stood and let her read. When she finished the summary, she turned to the third page, which was a copy of the original after-action report. She knew most of it. She had given testimony for portions of it in a debrief room in Stuttgart 10 days after Kassala, when she was still running on something that was not quite sleep and not quite function, but was keeping her upright. What she hadn't known was the section on page 9. She read it twice. Her jaw tightened. "They changed the recommendation," she said. "The original recommendation credited you with primary responsibility for the evacuation outcome. 14 survivors, 3 serious injuries managed under field conditions without resupply or reinforcement, enemy contact at 2 intervals." Merritt's voice was even. "That recommendation included a commendation for the Distinguished Service Cross." She looked at him. "That's not what was filed." "No," he said. "It's not." "Who changed it?" "The investigation identified 2 officers in the chain of review. One of them has since retired. The other is currently serving in a logistics role at Fort Brennan." He paused. "The motivation, as best we can reconstruct it, was a combination of factors. You were a woman in a combat role that was technically outside the parameters of your attachment. Acknowledging the full scope of what you did would have required acknowledging the full scope of what you were doing there. Which would have been embarrassing for the people who'd been telling Congress women couldn't operate in those parameters," Elena said. "Yes." She closed the file. The clarity of it was almost worse than anger would have been. Anger would have been easier. There was somewhere to put anger. This was just the plain shape of a thing that had been done, arranged in official language on official paper, and it sat in her hands like something geological, like something that had taken a long time to form and had no particular interest in her reaction to it. 6 years, she said. I know. I left the service because I thought... She stopped. The report said I was missing, presumed killed. I was told it was an administrative error. I thought the whole record was compromised. I thought that no one was going to do anything about it, Merritt finished. And for a long time they weren't. He looked at her directly. I wasn't either, and that's the thing I owe you an explanation for. She waited. I pushed back on the initial filing, he said. Internally, I put my objections in writing. I was told the report had been finalized and that reopening it would be... The word used was disruptive. I was 3 months from a promotion review. He said it plainly, without looking away. I chose the promotion. The hallway was quiet. Then 18 months ago, he continued, a junior analyst doing a standard records audit flagged the recommendation anomaly. It went to IG. IG opened the inquiry, and I was asked to provide a full account of what I had observed. He exhaled. I gave it. Everything. Which was, at that point, the least I could do. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Is that why you're here? She said. Obligation? Partly, he said. And partly because I heard what happened in that trauma bay last night, and I needed to see for myself that you were still... He stopped. Still what? Still standing. Something moved behind her expression. Not much. Just enough to be human. I'm still standing, she said. He nodded once, and in that nod was the compressed weight of 6 years of a decision he'd made and the specific quality of having to look at its consequences in the face. General Okafor needs both of us in the room, he said. Elena tucked the file under her arm and walked back down the corridor, and Merritt walked beside her, and neither of them said anything for the remainder of the distance. The interview room had changed in the 15 minutes she'd been gone. 2 additional people were present. A woman in a civilian suit who introduced herself as the Defense Medical Oversight Attorney, and a man who was Halverson's general counsel, who looked like he hadn't anticipated coming in this early and hadn't fully recovered from the surprise. On the table, Okafor's aide had opened a second laptop. The recorder had been repositioned. Karras was there too. He was sitting against the wall in a chair that was clearly not at the table by design, which told Elena everything about how Okafor had organized the room. Merritt sat at the table. Elena sat beside him. Before we continue, Okafor said, I want to establish for the record that Colonel Merritt is here as a voluntary witness in the IG inquiry reopened 18 months ago, and as a corroborating source for Captain for Ms. Ward's service history. She looked at Elena. You've reviewed the file? Yes. Do you want to add anything to what you've told me previously about your decision to leave the service? Elena set the file on the table. The official record said I was missing, presumed killed. When I surfaced and tried to clarify that through proper channels, I was told the record would be corrected administratively, but it never was. I assumed the whole after-action reporting had been contaminated by the circumstances. I left before I could be formally processed out, which I understand created its own set of issues. You understand that leaving without formal separation complicates certain entitlements. I didn't leave for entitlements, Elena said. I left because I couldn't keep doing the work in the environment that produced what happened in that report. And you chose to continue doing the work in a different form. Yes. Okafor turned to Karras. Mr. Karras, you authorized a performance notation on Ms. Ward's record following a mass casualty response in which her interventions are now being credited with preventing at least 2 patient deaths. Can you explain the clinical basis for that decision? Karras's jaw moved. His general counsel put a hand on his arm. Mr. Karras has been advised, the general counsel said carefully, to reserve substantive responses until we've had time to review the specific documentation. The documentation, Okafor said, in a tone that was perfectly pleasant and meant nothing pleasant, is what I'm looking at right now. The general counsel said something in Karras's ear. Karras nodded. We'll need to defer, the general counsel said. Okafor turned her attention back to Elena. Walk me through last night, beginning to end. Clinical specifics. Elena laid it out, patient by patient, injury by injury. The sequence of assessments and decisions and interventions stated in the flat, precise language of clinical documentation. No drama. No self-justification, just the anatomy of 90 minutes in which things had been wrong and she had worked to make them less wrong. When she finished, Okafor looked at Merritt. "Colonel?" "Everything she just described," Merritt said, "is consistent with the field performance documented in the original unaltered after-action report from Kassala, including the pattern recognition, the prioritization under multi-casualty conditions, and the specific clinical interventions." He paused. "The tension pneumothorax identification on 2 separate patients, under those conditions, in that time frame, is not a guess. It's a train differential that most physicians working in controlled environments don't develop to that level." "She identified it in a patient in week 1 of her posting here," Okafor said, looking at her notes. "On her 3rd shift." "Yes," Merritt said, and the attending physician's documented response was that she was guessing. "Yes," Merritt said again. Okafor let the silence do the work that commentary would have done less efficiently. Sad. Marcus Vale arrived at the second-floor conference area at 9:10 a.m. He had spoken with hospital legal for 40 minutes and had come out of that conversation with a clear understanding that the trajectory of the morning was not going in a direction that benefited him. He was accompanied by the legal representative, a woman named Pratt, who had the brisk, professionally opaque manner of someone who made a living protecting institutions from the consequences of their own decisions. He had also, Elena learned later, spent the preceding 40 minutes reviewing his own documentation. There was a specific moment, she was told, when Vale understood the problem. It wasn't the incident reports. It was the medication dosing error she had caught during the mass casualty activation in month 2. The one he had subsequently documented as a near miss attributable to nursing floor coordination failures, without noting that it was a member of the nursing floor who had flagged and corrected it. He had used that near miss as a line item in the performance review that recommended her reassignment. Documented, signed, submitted. The same medication that would have harmed a patient, if not for Elena, used as a data point against her. When Okafor's aide brought the full performance file into the interview room and placed it on the table, Pratt asked to review it before any further discussion. Okafor said that was appropriate and gave her 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, Elena sat in the break room down the hall with a paper cup of water and did not think about any of it. She thought about patient 2 from the night before, the one with the abdominal trauma, who had gone into surgery at 1 a.m., and whether the 7 a.m. attending had reviewed the post-surgical notes. She took out her phone and sent a note to Dario asking him to confirm. He responded in 4 minutes. "Viewing now, looks stable, will flag if anything changes." She put her phone away. Merritt came in partway through the 20 minutes and sat across from her. "You're thinking about the patients," he said. "One of them," she said. He nodded. "That's exactly what I should have put in front of the people who changed that report," he said. "What you were thinking about, while everything else was happening around you. It didn't occur to me to frame it that way, and it should have." She looked at him. "You think that would have mattered?" "Probably not," he said, "but it would have been the right frame." She turned the paper cup in her hands. "What happens now with the IG inquiry?" "The 2 officers who altered the report will face formal proceedings. One is retired, so it's limited, but it goes on the permanent record. The other is still serving. It'll be a board, career consequences." He paused. "And the original recommendation will be restored. The DSC." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't want a ceremony," she said. "That's not your call." "I know." She looked at the cup. I don't want it made into something. The 14 people. They didn't survive because of a medal's worth of effort. They survived because there was no other option, and I happened to have the training." "That's true of every act of valor on record," Merritt said. "Then the record should say it differently." He almost smiled. "It didn't quite make it to the surface, but it was there underneath." "I'll put that in my statement," he said. "Paseb." The 20 minutes became 40, then 50. When the attorney Pratt emerged from the conference room, her professional opacity had developed a faint crack around the edges, the kind that happens when a person who has built a career on managing documentation encounters documentation that has built a very effective case against their client over 4 months. She asked to speak with Vale privately. That conversation happened in a small office down the hall, behind a closed door, and took 11 minutes. Elena didn't hear any of it. She was back in the main conference room when Vale came in. He looked like a man who had spent the last 3 hours watching a decision he'd made 4 months ago compound into something he could no longer contain. He sat across from Okafor with Pratt beside him, and the expression on his face was not the controlled authority she had spent 4 months seeing deployed in the trauma bay. It was more honest than that. Not remorse exactly, but the specific sour look of a person who has arrived at consequences ahead of schedule and without adequate preparation. Okafor asked him to describe, in his own words, the basis for the incident report he'd filed following the month 2 mass casualty response. Vale answered carefully, citing protocol, scope of authority, the importance of chain of command in critical care environments. Okafor let him finish. Then she put the medication error documentation on the table. The room was quiet. The nursing staff member who identified and corrected this error before patient administration, Okafor said. Was that Ms. Ward? Vale glanced at Pratt. Pratt gave him nothing. Yes, he said. And in your incident report filed 5 days later, this near miss is described as a nursing floor coordination failure. Another pause, longer this time. The documentation could have been more specific, he said. More specific, Okafor repeated. The two words sat on the table like objects. This documentation was used as a line item in a performance review that recommended Ms. Ward's reassignment from the trauma department. The department she has now demonstrated under federal examination she is better qualified to work in than most of the people who excluded her from it. She set her pen down. Do you want to revise your characterization of the documentation? Pratt put her hand briefly on Vale's arm. He said, I may have allowed personal frustration to influence the framing of certain reports. It was the smallest version of an admission that an admission could be while still technically counting as one. Elena, sitting against the wall with the sealed file in her lap, looked at him when he said it. He didn't look back. By noon, the formal interview process had produced a documented record that ran to 47 pages in Okafor's aide's laptop and would eventually expand to several hundred when the full IG supplement was attached. Elena had answered every question. She had not editorialized and she had not softened anything. And she had also not exaggerated, because exaggeration was unnecessary when the plain facts were doing this much work on their own. She was released from the formal interview process at 12:15 p.m. She had been awake for 31 hours. She went back to the nursing floor. Dario looked at her when she appeared at the station. You don't have to be here, he said. Patient 2, she said. The abdominal trauma from last night. What are his morning labs showing? He pulled the chart and showed her. She reviewed it, made a note, flagged a concern about his creatinine trending slightly upward. Not alarming, but worth monitoring for renal strain post-surgical. And added a note to the chart recommending increased fluid monitoring. Done, she said. She handed the chart back. Elena. He used her first name without thinking about it, then seemed to notice and not correct himself. Half the floor knows there's a federal review. Vale hasn't come back to the trauma bay since this morning. Karis called a department meeting for 3 p.m. and then canceled it 20 minutes later. She nodded. People are scared, he said. They should be doing their jobs, she said. The patients are the same today as they were yesterday. She picked up her patient list and started her afternoon rounds. It wasn't composure for its own sake. It wasn't performance. It was that the work was the thing that had kept her functional through every version of this, and she was not going to stop doing it because the institutional structure around her had begun to shift. The patients in those beds had no part in what was happening on the second floor and in the administrative records and in the career calculations of people who had misjudged her. They were just sick or injured or scared or all three. She was still the person in the room who knew how to help them. That hadn't changed this morning. It wouldn't change this afternoon. At 2, she was in the middle of a wound assessment on a veteran in room 7 when her pager went off. Not the standard notification tone, but the triple pulse of a trauma activation. She finished the assessment, documented it in 30 seconds flat, told the veteran she'd be back, and moved to trauma. What she found when she arrived stopped her for 1 full second. Harlan Oates was not in the ICU. He was in the trauma bay, on a gurney, with a crash cart beside him, and Fenn working over him with the particular focused urgency of a physician dealing with an arrhythmia that had arrived without warning. The monitor above him was showing an irregular rhythm, not ventricular fibrillation, but a rapid, erratic pattern that was eating into his blood pressure in real time. When did he arrest? Elena said, already moving. He didn't fully arrest, Fenn said, not looking up. He coded at about a 7, sustained VTAC, self-terminated, but now he's in rapid AFib and his pressure's dropping. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the IV line. She looked at the medication log clipped to the end of the gurney. She saw it immediately. Who ordered the morning antibiotic? Fenn looked up. What? She pulled the medication log. The antibiotic ordered for Oates' wound infection, appropriate drug, appropriate dose, had been administered at 9 a.m. The rhythm disturbance had begun, per the ICU notes, at approximately 2:30 p.m. She checked his chart for the full medication list. There it was. A QT prolonging drug interaction between the antibiotic and a cardiac medication that had been added to his regimen post-surgery during the overnight period, added by a resident who hadn't cross-checked the full medication list. 2 drugs, individually safe. Together, in a patient with his specific cardiac history from the blast injury, producing exactly what the monitor was showing. Stop the antibiotic, she said. He needs a different agent, and he needs IV magnesium for the arrhythmia management, 2 grams over 15 minutes. Fenn stared at her. It's a drug interaction, she said. QT prolongation. Check the post-surgical add-on and his antibiotic. They're not compatible with his cardiac history. Fenn looked at the chart. He found the interaction in 12 seconds. Get magnesium, he said to the nearest nurse. Now, and hold the antibiotic. Elena moved to Harlan's side. His eyes were open. He was conscious, which was impressive given his blood pressure, and his expression when he saw her was the expression of a man who was in significant distress but had the training to not fully show it. You're in an arrhythmia, she said. Medication interaction. We're correcting it. Fantastic, he said, on an exhale that was trying to be dry, but came out thinner than intended. Lie still. Wasn't planning anything else. The magnesium went in. The team watched the monitor. The rhythm was still irregular, still fast, but the trend over the next 4 minutes was towards something more manageable. Not resolved, but the direction was right. Fenn called the cardiologist on the floor. Elena stayed. She stayed because the case wasn't closed, and because she had caught the interaction, and until it was managed, she was the person in the room with the most complete picture of what was happening. Fenn didn't ask her to leave. Nobody asked her to leave. 17 minutes into the magnesium infusion, Harlan's rhythm converted, an almost audible shift on the monitor, the pattern smoothing from erratic to sinus, the blood pressure beginning to rise. Fenn exhaled. Harlan opened his eyes. He looked at Elena. Again, he said. Don't make it a habit, she said. I feel like you keep saving my life and I keep not knowing how to repay it. Get discharged without complications, she said. That would be a good start. The cardiologist arrived, reviewed the situation, confirmed the interaction, ordered adjusted medications. The team around Harlan began reorganizing. Elena stepped back, made her documentation, checked the time. She had been awake for 34 hours. When she looked up from the chart, Okafor was standing at the entrance to the trauma bay. She had come down from the second floor at some point in the last half hour, and she was watching the aftermath of the intervention with the expression of someone who has spent the morning gathering evidence and has just watched that evidence walk across the room and save a man's life in real time. Their eyes met across the bay. Elena looked back at her chart and finished the documentation. She had nothing to prove to anyone in this room. She had said that to herself at various points over the last 4 months, and meant it with varying levels of success. But right now, in this specific moment, she meant it completely. Not because there was nothing left to prove, but because the proving was finished. It had happened in the only way she had ever trusted, not through argument, not through appeal, but through the work, through the patience, through the irreducible fact of what happened when she was in the room. She closed the chart. She was reaching for the next task on her list when Fenn appeared beside her. His face had the particular look of someone arriving at a sentence they've been composing for hours. The performance review, he said. The reassignment. It takes effect in 4 days, she said. I know. He paused. I don't think it's going to take effect. That's not your call, she said. Karis called me 15 minutes ago. He stopped. Something has changed in the administrative review. I don't have the full picture, but he asked me to find you and ask you to come back upstairs. He looked at her. He said the word Immediately. I've never heard Karis use that word. Elena set the chart on the station counter. She had been awake for 34 hours and her feet hurt, and she hadn't eaten anything since a nutrition bar at 3 a.m., and she was operating on the specific reserve that only activates when there is simply no alternative to continuing. She straightened. Where? She said. Same room, Fen said. But it's not just Okafor anymore. Something in the way he said it made her look at him directly. Who else? She said. He looked uncomfortable in the way people look when they're carrying information that is large enough to be uncomfortable to carry. There's a news crew, he said, outside the building. They've been there for about 40 minutes, and there are 2 more vehicles in the parking structure. Base command this time, not oversight. He swallowed. And someone from the Secretary of the Army's office has been on a call with Okafor since 2 p.m. Elena held her expression steady. The Secretary's office, she said. Yes. She breathed in through her nose. Out. I'll be right there, she said. She picked up her badge, straightened her scrubs, and started for the elevator. Behind her, the trauma bay continued its work. Monitors, ventilators, the quiet mechanical insistence of a room that kept people alive regardless of what was happening in the administrative floors above it. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. And in that brief suspended moment between floors, between the 34 hours behind her and whatever was now assembled above her, she looked at her own reflection in the polished metal of the elevator door, at the scrubs and the badge and the simple stud earrings and the sleeve covering the 5 violet marks on her forearm. She looked like a nurse. She had always looked like a nurse. That had never been the problem. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. And the first thing she saw when she stepped into the second-floor corridor was not Okafor, and not Karis, and not the attorney, or the aide, or the general counsel. It was a man she recognized, a man who should not have been here at all, whose presence in this building made no logistical or protocol sense given his role and his position, and the fact that she was a civilian nurse in a mid-sized military medical center in a city that was not Washington and was not anywhere near it. He was standing in the corridor in full dress uniform, holding a document she recognized by its cover format, even from 15 feet away. It was an official service commendation, and she had approximately 3 seconds to understand what was happening before he looked up and saw her and said her name. Not ward, not nurse, not captain, but her full name, the name under which she had served, spoken in the voice of someone making a formal statement in front of the 2 journalists who had apparently been allowed inside after all, and were standing 6 feet to his left with a camera and a recorder, and the particular alertness of people who understand they are watching something that will matter. Elena stopped walking. Her heart rate was exactly what it always was. Her hands were still. And 3 seconds later, when she understood the full shape of what was assembled in that corridor for her, the record restored, the commendation, the people who had dismissed her now standing witness to all of it, the thing she felt was not triumph, and it was not relief, and it was not any of the things she might have expected. It was grief, clean and specific and immediate, for the years. For the soldiers she hadn't been able to reach, for the version of herself that had stood in a different corridor in a different country and made a decision in the dark that nobody had ever properly acknowledged, and had then spent 6 years carrying the weight of that unacknowledgement in a body that still wore its marks. She stood in the corridor of Halverson Military Medical Center, 34 hours without sleep, in her nurse's scrubs, and looked at the man in dress uniform and the document in his hands. And the cameras were rolling. The man in dress uniform was Brigadier General Warren Colt, Deputy Surgeon General of the Army, and he had flown into Delvane Regional Airport at 11:40 a.m. on a flight that had not been on any schedule Elena could have checked even if she'd thought to look. She had not thought to look. She had been keeping a veteran alive. Colt was 61, with the particular kind of face that has been composed for official occasions so many times it defaults there naturally. But there was something underneath the official composure right now. A specific alertness that Elena recognized as the look of a person who has been briefed on a situation and is now encountering the reality of it, and finding that the briefing, however thorough, had not fully prepared him. He looked at her the way people look at things they were told about, but didn't quite believe until this moment. She walked the remaining 15 feet and stopped in front of him. "Ms. Ward," he said, formally, for the record and the camera. "General," she said. He held out the document. She took it. It was the restored commendation. The original recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross, with the alterations removed and the record corrected. Her full service name was on the cover. The citation was 4 paragraphs describing Operation Forward Tide in language that was still, necessarily, redacted in parts, but which said clearly and without qualification what she had done and what it had cost and what it had produced. She read it once. Then she folded it with care and held it at her side. On behalf of the Secretary of the Army, Colt said, and pursuant to the corrected after-action record of Operation Forward Tide, March 2021, this commendation is formally presented with acknowledgement that the original documentation was improperly altered and that the record should have reflected these findings 6 years ago. He paused. It was not a scripted pause. I'm sorry that it didn't. The two journalists, right? A man with a camera and a woman with a recorder who had introduced herself downstairs as Mira Doss from the Delvane Courier-Herald, were recording everything. Doss had the expression of someone who had been told she was coming to cover a routine federal review and had arrived to find something considerably larger. Elena looked at Colt. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, direct, no performance. The cameras could do what they wanted with that. Okafor was standing to Colt's left. Merritt was behind him. Karras was at the far end of the corridor near the stairwell, with his general counsel, both of them occupying the specific physical position of people who are present because they are required to be and are making themselves as small as possible while being present. Vale was not there. Elena noticed his absence and catalogued it and moved on. What? The formal part lasted 12 minutes. Colt made a brief statement, on record, for Doss's recorder and the camera, acknowledging the IG findings, confirming the DSC restoration, and using the phrase significant institutional failure in reference to the original reporting alteration. He did not name the 2 officers responsible for that alteration by name, but he confirmed they were subject to ongoing proceedings, which Doss would follow up on and which would eventually appear in print with enough specificity to matter. After Colt finished, Okafor indicated to Doss that the formal portion was concluded and that any further press access would need to go through official channels. Doss accepted this with professional grace and asked if she could request a brief statement from Elena directly. Elena looked at her. "Tomorrow," she said. "I've been awake for 35 hours and I have patience." Doss nodded. She handed Elena her card. Elena put it in her pocket. The corridor began to clear. Colt shook Elena's hand, a formal grip, brief, with just enough weight in it to communicate that it was not entirely formal, and moved toward the elevator with his aide. Okafor stayed. When the corridor was down to Elena, Okafor, Merritt, and the institutional wreckage of Halverson's administrative mourning, Okafor said, "There are personnel decisions that will come out of today. Karras knows, the board has been notified. Vale's documentation issues are being referred to the State Medical Board for independent review." "The State Medical Board," Elena said. "The medication error documentation," Okafor said, "using a patient safety event to build a retaliatory case against the staff member who caught it. That's not an internal HR issue. That's a licensing matter." Elena was quiet for a moment. She had known it was serious. She had known it from the day she'd seen the performance review, had recognized the shape of what Vale had done in the same way she recognized injury patterns. Not because she was looking for it, but because the presentation was unmistakable once you knew the physiology. But hearing it named as a licensing matter, hearing it escalated to the level where a man's ability to practice medicine was on the table, produced a complicated feeling that was not satisfaction. "I didn't want his license," she said. "I know," Okafor said. "I wanted to do my job." "I know that too." Okafor looked at her steadily. What he did with that documentation could have resulted in patient harm if the reassignment had gone through and a less qualified nurse had been managing those cases. That's the basis for the referral. It's not about you. It's about what the pattern of behavior means for future patients. Elena understood that. She did. The clinical logic was sound. It still felt like weight she hadn't asked to carry. "What happens to the reassignment?" she said. "It's suspended pending review, which, given the documentation now in the record, effectively means it's dissolved." Okafor paused. "That's Halverson's decision to make formally. But the oversight letter I'm sending this afternoon will make the preferred outcome fairly clear." "And Karras?" He authorized a retaliatory performance action based on incomplete information provided by a physician with a documented conflict of interest. Whether that constitutes gross negligence or poor judgment is going to be a question for the board. Okafor tilted her head slightly. My recommendation will be that it constitutes both. Elena nodded. Merritt had been standing quietly through all of this. He spoke now, for the first time since the corridor had cleared. There's one more thing, he said. The Army Medical Department has been in contact with Halverson's administration about a potential formal partnership, incorporating field trauma protocols into the hospital's mass casualty training program, based on last night's activation. He looked at Elena. Based specifically on your performance during last night's activation. A training program, she said. It would require someone to develop the curriculum, someone with both the field experience and the current clinical context to make it applicable to a hospital setting. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm a nurse, she said. I'm not a program developer. You're also a decorated combat medic with 6 years of civilian hospital experience and a demonstrated ability to operate under conditions that most training programs don't adequately simulate. He held her gaze. You don't have to decide anything today. I'm aware, she said. She looked at the commendation in her hand, then she folded it once more precisely and slid it into the pocket of her scrubs. I'm going back to my floor, she said. Okafor nodded. She went. The nursing floor in the early afternoon had the tempo of a shift that has absorbed a major disruption and is working to reestablish its rhythm, slightly offbeat, people moving with the extra efficiency of those who are compensating for something they haven't fully processed yet. Elena walked into it and picked up her patient list without announcing herself and started where she'd left off. Dario fell into step beside her within 40 seconds. How are you still standing? He said. Practice, she said. Half the floor has been on their phones all morning. Someone posted something about the Federal Review on the hospital's community board. He paused. And Vale's not here. Nobody's officially said anything, but do your patients know where their nurse is? She said. He blinked. What? Do your patients know you're focused on them? He straightened. Yes. Then that's the conversation we should be having. He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, Right, okay. And he peeled off toward his own patient list without further comment. She spent the next 3 hours doing the work. The post-surgical patient in room 3 needed a drainage change. The veteran in room 7 had developed a low-grade fever that needed to be assessed and documented. A new admission came in from the base clinic, a young specialist with a badly infected laceration that had been undertreated for 4 days, and Elena managed the initial assessment, irrigation, and redressing with the assistance of a second-year resident who was clearly nervous and whom she walked through the procedure with the specific patience she reserved for people who were learning rather than people who should already know. You're teaching again, Dario said, passing in the corridor. I'm supervising, she said. Same thing, from where I'm standing. She didn't answer that. At 4:30 p.m., Petra Gans found her in the supply room. This was becoming a pattern. The supply room as the place where honest conversations happened, because it was the one room in the hospital where nobody was performing for anyone. Petra looked like she had slept less than she needed to and had been thinking more than she wanted to. Vale's gone, Petra said. He came in this morning, met with legal, and left at noon. Nobody's officially said suspended, but the schedule's been reallocated for the next 2 weeks. Elena opened a supply cabinet and counted dressing packs. He did it himself, Petra said. The thing with the performance report, that was deliberate. Yes. Did you know? When it was happening? I knew the report didn't reflect what had occurred, Elena said. I didn't know how it would land. Petra was quiet for a moment. I said things about you that I shouldn't have. At the beginning. You said you thought I was arrogant. I thought you thought you were better than us. Elena set down the dressing packs and looked at her directly. I didn't think I was better. I thought I was different. There's a gap between those two things, and I probably didn't do enough to bridge it. Petra looked surprised. It was a small surprise, quickly processed. That's a generous way to characterize it. It's an accurate way, Elena said. I came in here with a past I wasn't going to explain, which made me opaque, which made me look like I was keeping score. Some of that was my choice. Some of it was other people's choices, Elena said. But I'm not interested in sorting that out at the end of a 36-hour stretch. Something crossed Petra's face, a kind of reluctant respect that people show when they've been expecting someone to be smaller than they are and have encountered the actual size. The 6 patients last month, Petra said. During the first activation, I told Karis I thought you'd exceeded your scope. Elena was quiet. I backed Vale's version, Petra said. Not because I thought it was right, because it was easier. The supply room was very quiet. I know, Elena said. I'm sorry. Elena picked up the dressing packs and tucked them under her arm. She looked at Petra for a moment, at the genuine discomfort on her face, at the effort it had taken to be in this room saying this, at the particular human difficulty of being someone who has done a small wrong and has to live in the aftermath of it, while the person you wronged is still standing in front of you. Don't do it again, Elena said. Not forgiveness, exactly. But the door left open, which was all she had the energy for right now, and perhaps more than had been earned. She went back to her patients. The State Medical Board referral for Vale became public knowledge at 6 p.m. when Mira Das published an initial piece online, brief, factual, sourced to Okafor's office and confirmed by hospital administration, that described the federal review, the personnel action, and the referral without naming the physician by name, since the board proceedings were formally under review. It didn't need to name him. Halverson was not a large institution, and the piece contained enough detail that anyone inside it understood exactly who was meant. Elena found out about the piece at 6:15 when Dario showed her his phone. She read it once. It was accurate. It was restrained in a way that suggested Doss was planning something longer, that this was a placeholder, not the full account. She handed the phone back. You're not going to read it again? He said. I read it once, she said. That's enough. At 7 p.m., Aldous Karis appeared on the nursing floor for the first time all day. He walked to where Elena was charting at the station and stood beside her without speaking for a moment. He looked like a man who had made a series of small, individually defensible decisions that had accumulated into something he could not defend. The board has asked me to formally withdraw the reassignment order, he said. I heard, she said, without looking up from the chart. I wanted to tell you directly. She finished the charting, closed the screen, and looked at him. There was a version of this moment she had imagined, not fantasized about. She wasn't built for fantasizing, but a version she had been aware of as a theoretical possibility during the months of dismissals and performance notes, and the small, grinding accumulation of being minimized. In that version, there was a certain satisfaction, something clean. This was not that version. Karis looked tired and diminished and genuinely uncertain, which was a more honest version of him than she'd seen before. He wasn't performing contrition. He was experiencing the actual version of it, which is less clean but more real. I made decisions based on incomplete information, he said, and I accepted that information without the scrutiny I should have applied. You accepted it because the source was familiar and I wasn't, she said, which is a pattern that exists everywhere and is easier to maintain than to examine. She paused. But it has consequences for patients. That's the part that matters. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something more and couldn't locate it. Good night, Mr. Karis, she said. He left. Juan. She finally went home at 8:45 p.m. Her apartment was 12 minutes from Halverson, and she drove there in the particular state of extended wakefulness that is past tired and into something that feels strange and very clear, the way the world looks when you've been awake long enough that the normal filters are gone, and everything is either very important or very unimportant, and nothing is in between. She ate something, bread and peanut butter and a glass of water, standing at the counter because sitting down felt like a commitment she wasn't ready to make. She looked at the commendation, still folded in her pocket. She took it out and set it on the table. She did not look at it for a long time. Then she opened it and read the citation again, properly this time, without the cameras and the corridor and the 35 hours of accumulated weight. It was well written, which she hadn't expected. Whoever had drafted it had done their homework. The language was specific and procedurally accurate, and the description of what she had done in that FOB without supply lines or medical infrastructure or backup of any kind was rendered in a way that was honest about how close the margin had been. It didn't make it sound clean. It didn't make her sound extraordinary exactly. It made it sound like an extraordinary situation that had required extraordinary response, which was more accurate. 14 people. She thought about each one of them, briefly, in the way she sometimes allowed herself to do when she was alone and not operating. Not going through them systematically, just the way memory works, arriving at faces and moments without schedule. She thought about the four who had stayed in touch for a while and then drifted into their own lives, which was the right thing, which was what she wanted. She thought about the one who had died 8 months after the operation from injuries that weren't related to Kasala. She'd found out through a third party, 2 years later, and had sat with that for a week before putting it somewhere she could carry it. She thought about Harlan Oates in the ICU, stable now, his arrhythmia resolved, his vitals moving in the right direction. She had saved his life twice in 18 hours, which was remarkable only in how unremarkable it felt from the inside. She folded the commendation and put it in the drawer beside the table. She went to bed. She slept for 11 hours. She came back to Halverson the next morning at 7 a.m., 2 minutes before her shift started, with coffee she'd made herself and a change of the same scrubs she always wore. Nothing was different on the outside. The badge was the same. The shoes were the same. The floor, however, was different, not dramatically. Halverson didn't do drama in daylight, as a general rule, but the quality of how people moved around her had changed. Residents who had previously offered the minimum required acknowledgement were now making eye contact. Nurses who had absorbed Petra's early characterization of her were recalibrating in the visible, slightly effortful way of people who are adjusting a position they'd held for months. It was not comfortable, and it was not uncomfortable. It simply was. She found Dario at the station and got her patient list. Oates was moved to step down last night, he said. Cardiologist is happy with the rhythm. Good. He asked if you'd come by when you had time. I'll check his chart first, she said. She did. His rhythm was stable, his wound culture had come back, and the adjusted antibiotic was doing its job. She went to step down at 8:20, between 2 other tasks, and found him sitting up in bed looking considerably more like a person than he had 48 hours ago. You look better, she said. I feel about 40% terrible, which is an improvement, he said. I heard things happened while I was busy nearly dying. Some things. The corridor, the general, and the commendation. He looked at her steadily. I heard Doss from the Courier Herald was there. She was. So it's public. Some of it. The rest will be. She checked his drainage, noted the improvement, updated the chart. You called Okafor at 4 a.m. I did. You didn't have to do that. He was quiet for a moment. You know what the briefing on Forward Tide said? What it said about Ghost Actual, before the correction. She waited. It said the medic assigned to that operation exceeded standard field medicine parameters and made decisions inconsistent with established protocol, resulting in resource allocation that was, I'm paraphrasing, non-standard and difficult to assess for compliance. His jaw tightened. Non-standard. That's what they wrote about keeping 14 people alive. And I read that briefing and I filed it and I moved on, because that's what you do when you're 28 and you trust the institutional record. He looked at her. I've had a long time to not be okay with that. She set the chart down. It's corrected now, she said. Because of Okafor and the IG and Merritt and everyone involved in the review, he said, which is a lot of machinery to mobilize. Someone had to start it. The records analyst who flagged the anomaly 18 months ago started it. And I finished the last mile, he said. Maybe. He looked at her. I'd do it again. I know, she said. She picked up the chart and finished her notations. At the door she paused. Your sister, she said. In Portland. She's listed as your emergency contact. Yeah. Have you called her? He looked momentarily caught. I was planning to. She's been your emergency contact for 12 years and you nearly coded yesterday, Elena said. Call her. She left. At 10 a.m., Mirados published the full piece. It ran 1,400 words in the Courier Herald and was picked up by the regional AP wire within the hour. By noon, it had been shared across 3 military community forums and 2 veteran advocacy platforms. By 2 p.m., a national outlet had reached out to Doss for syndication rights. Elena knew none of this in real time. She was managing a case on the floor that required her full attention, a post-operative patient developing early signs of a complication that needed to be caught in the next 20 minutes, or would require significantly more intervention to address. She caught it in 16. She found out about the article's reach when she finally took a break at 2:30 and Petra appeared at the break room door with her phone turned outward. Elena looked at the screen. She saw the headline. Halverson nurse was decorated war medic, record show. Federal Review finds pattern of retaliation. And below it the photograph that Doss must have sourced from the official commendation event, showing Elena in her scrubs, the commendation in her hand, standing in the corridor of a military hospital looking like exactly what she was. She looked at it for 4 seconds. It's sharing fast, Petra said. I see that. There's... The comment section on the military community forum has people who were at Forward Tide. Petra hesitated. People saying things. Elena set the phone on the table and did not reach for it again. I have a patient in room 11 whose pain management hasn't been adequately adjusted since this morning, she said. Can you look at the chart and flag it for the attending? Petra blinked. Then she took her phone back, and her expression did the thing it had been doing more frequently in the last 12 hours, adjusting, recalibrating, becoming something more honest than what it had been. I'll handle it, she said. She left. Elena sat in the break room for 4 more minutes. She drank the coffee she'd made at 6 a.m. and was no longer hot. She thought about the article, about the forums, about the names and faces that might be in those comment sections. People she had carried through a night in Kassala, or people who knew people she'd carried, or people who had only heard about it through briefings that had previously described her in the language of non-compliance. It was a lot to be public. She wasn't sure yet how she felt about public. She went back to work. At 4:15 p.m., hospital administration sent a building-wide communication acknowledging the federal review, confirming that personnel actions are underway consistent with the findings, and announcing a scheduled all-staff meeting for the following week to discuss what they were calling a review of trauma department protocols and clinical authority structures. Elena read the communication once and deleted it from her inbox. At 5:20, the attending who had been covering Vale's caseload during his absence, a contract physician named Dr. Yara Obeng, who had been brought in from the base clinic, found Elena at the station and introduced herself. I've been reviewing the trauma cases for the last quarter, Obeng said. She was direct in the manner of someone who didn't have the context for the hospital's internal politics and wasn't interested in acquiring it. Your chart notes are the most thorough documentation I've seen in this department, specifically around the clinical reasoning on non-obvious presentations. Thank you, Elena said. I'm not saying it to compliment you, Obeng said. I'm saying it because I want to understand the reasoning. The tension pneumo pattern you've flagged twice. Is that a tactile assessment or a visual one? Elena looked at her for a moment. A real question, clinically specific, from someone who wanted to learn something. Both, she said. The visual presentation is subtle but consistent if you know what you're looking at. The tactile component is more reliable in low light or degraded visual environments. Where did you develop that? Field conditions, Elena said. Obeng nodded. Would you be willing to walk through it for the residents? The next teach session is Friday. Elena paused. I'll think about it, she said. Obeng nodded again, apparently satisfied with that, and moved on to the next item on her list. Elena stood at the station for a moment after she left. Friday. Teaching. Translating what she knew in her hands and her pattern recognition into language that could be passed on. That had always been the part she was uncertain about, the part that felt most exposed. What she knew, she had learned in conditions that couldn't be replicated in a hospital corridor or a teach session. She wasn't sure how much of it survived the translation. But Obeng was asking. The residents needed it, and she thought about the specialist with the infected laceration yesterday, the second-year resident she'd walked through the irrigation procedure, the look on his face when he understood what he was doing and why. Maybe some of it survived. At 6:30, she was finishing her charting for the day when her phone buzzed. Not a hospital notification, but a personal message. She didn't recognize the number, but the area code was from a base she recognized. She opened it. The message was 5 words. We remember. All of us. No name, no context needed. She put her phone away and finished her chart. At 6:47, as she was putting on her jacket, Karras's assistant appeared in the doorway of the nursing station. Ms. Ward, Mr. Karras would like to see you before you leave. She considered the invitation. She was tired, not in the blunt way of yesterday's 36 hours, but in the slower accumulating way of a day that had required a particular kind of sustained attention. "Tell him I'll stop by," she said. She stopped by. Karis's office looked the same as it always had. Organized, institutional, framed credentials on the wall. I was at his desk, but he was not doing the thing people at desks usually do to assert that the desk is their territory. He looked up when she came in and did not reach for any paperwork. "Sit down, please," he said. She sat. "The board met this afternoon," he said, informally, but the direction is clear. There will be a formal restructuring of clinical authority protocols in the trauma department, effective when the review closes. He paused. "There's also a question about the department lead position." She waited. "Vale's position is going to be vacant," Karis said. "Whether temporarily or permanently depends on the medical board review. In the interim, we need someone with both the clinical experience and the credibility, at this point, to stabilize the department." He looked at her directly. "I'd like you to consider an interim lead role." The room was quiet. She had not expected this. Not this specifically, not this quickly, not from him. "I'm a nurse," she said. "You're the most qualified clinician in this department by any metric that should matter," he said. "And I'm aware that I spent 4 months failing to recognize that, which is not a credential for me in this conversation. I know that. But the patients in this department need the department to function, and right now you're the reason they can." Elena looked at him. He was not performing humility. He was in the actual version of it, which meant he was uncomfortable and uncertain and saying what he believed to be true without knowing if it was enough. Which is how people sound when they're being honest in a situation where honesty has become the only available strategy. "I'll think about it," she said, again. The same word she'd given Obeng, which was not evasion, but was the accurate answer to something she needed more than 6 minutes to consider. He nodded. "That's all I'm asking." She stood. "One more thing," he said. She paused at the door. "The complaint filed with Defense Medical Oversight," he said. "I was told it came from 2 staff members who found the internal process inadequate. I assumed I knew who." He looked at her. "I was wrong. One of the complaints was filed by Kyle Moran, the traveling nurse who left last month. The other was filed by Dario Neff." She stood very still. Dario, who had helped her set up the secondary station before the activation, who had covered her patients without being asked, who had never in 4 months offered the small cruelties that others had deployed so casually. "He didn't tell me," she said. "He didn't want credit," Karis said. "He told the oversight officer he was filing because what was happening was wrong, and someone needed to say so externally since the internal process wasn't working." He paused. "He's 29 years old." She stood in the doorway. The weight of it was different from the commendation. The commendation was about the past, restoring a record, correcting a wrong that had calcified over years. This was about the present, about a 29-year-old nurse who had seen something unfair and done the one available thing, quietly, without telling her, without asking for acknowledgement. She thought about what she'd said to him that first activation morning. Trust it or don't. But decide now. He had trusted it then. He had trusted her again, in a different way, months later. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She left the office, walked down the corridor to the elevator, and pressed the button. While she waited, she thought about Dario and Oates calling Okafor at 4 a.m., and the anonymous message from the base area code, and Merritt standing in his dress uniform saying, "I chose the promotion with the directness of someone who had finally run out of reasons not to be direct." The elevator arrived. She stepped in. The doors were closing when her phone rang. Not a message this time, but an actual call, from a number she recognized as the hospital's administrative system. She looked at it. Then she looked at the floor indicator above the door, which showed she was between floors. She answered. The voice on the other end was not Karis. It was not Okafor. It was not anyone she had spoken to today. It was a woman who identified herself as the executive director of the Army Medical Department's Field Medicine Integration Office, a name Elena didn't recognize from an office she'd never heard of, and who said, in a voice that suggested she was accustomed to making calls that required immediate attention from the person receiving them. "Ms. Ward, I've been asked to reach you directly before this becomes a formal communication. There's a situation developing at Kelman Base that involves your specific expertise. and I've been told you're the only currently available person with both the clinical background and the field experience to advise on it. Elena's hand tightened on the phone. What situation? She said. The executive director told her. The elevator reached her floor, and the doors opened, and Elena stood in them as they started to close again, holding the phone to her ear, her face doing the thing it always did when the information arriving was larger than the moment she was standing in. She put her hand out and stopped the doors. Say that again, she said. The executive director said it again. There was a training convoy that had gone off a compromised bridge section on the eastern access road to Kelman Base. 6 vehicles, approximately 30 personnel. The lead truck partially submerged in a flooded drainage channel that the storm 2 nights ago had swollen to 4 times its normal width. Casualties unknown. The base clinic was overwhelmed. Their trauma surgeon was mid-surgery on an unrelated emergency. Halverson's closest trauma-capable staff, by geography, by availability, and by the specific combination of field and clinical experience the situation required, was standing in an elevator on the hospital's 3rd floor holding a phone. Elena listened to the full picture in 45 seconds. Then she said, "What's my transport?" "Base vehicle is in your parking structure now," the director said. "It's been there for 6 minutes. I need my field bag. Give me 4 minutes." She was already moving before the call ended. Her field bag lived in her locker because she had learned, a long time ago, that the difference between useful and useless in an emergency was usually just preparation that happened before the emergency began. It was not a dramatic bag. It was a standard duffel, packed to a specific list she updated every 2 weeks, containing the items that hospital supply rooms sometimes ran short of in the first critical minutes of a mass casualty response. And that took time to source when you didn't have time. She pulled it from her locker, signed out at the nursing station, not because she was required to in this situation, but because the patients needed coverage and Dario needed to know where she was, and walked to the parking structure without running, because running was for when you were already there. Dario was at the station when she passed. "Base convoy incident," she said. 30 personnel, multiple casualties. I'm advising on scene. He looked at her. "Do you need... Cover my 2 post-surgical patients for evening checks. Flag anything to Obeng." She paused at the door. "You filed the oversight complaint." He went very still. "Karis told me," she said. Dario held her gaze. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Someone had to." "Yes," she said. "Someone did." She held the door. "Thank you." She left before he could respond, which was deliberate. Not because she didn't want to hear what he would say, but because the moment felt complete already, and adding to it would have made it smaller. The base vehicle was a dark SUV with a driver who introduced himself as Corporal Huang and immediately put the vehicle in motion without being asked. He drove the way people drive when the destination is urgent, but getting there dead is not the objective. Fast, efficient, choosing routes that avoided the still-flooded intersections from the storm's aftermath. Elena rode in the back and reviewed what she knew. 30 personnel, lead vehicle submerged, bridge section compromised. The specific injuries in a vehicle submersion scenario depended on how fast the water was moving, how long personnel had been in it, whether the vehicle had rolled, and what the point of impact had been. You could expect a combination of traumatic injury from the impact itself and cold water shock from the flooding, and if any vehicles had gone fully under, you were dealing with near drowning on top of everything else, which added airway complexity to an already complex picture. She cataloged the likely presentations, prioritized the assessment sequence in her head, identified the equipment in her bag that would be first use. Then she put the calculation away and looked out the window at the road. The sky over Delvane had cleared completely since the storm. It was the kind of early evening that happens after bad weather. Everything washed clean and slightly too bright. The colors more saturated than usual, as if the world had been reset while no one was watching. The scene on the Eastern Access Road was organized chaos of the functional kind, meaning the chaos was still there, but people were moving through it with direction rather than in spite of it. 3 military ambulances were already on site. The bridge section was visible from the road's edge. A portion of the concrete had given way on the downstream side, dropping the lead vehicle's front end into the drainage channel at a 40-degree angle. The water was still fast-moving but lower than it had been at peak storm. 2 other vehicles had stopped in time. The remaining 3 had sustained impact damage on the road side, not the water side, from secondary collision when the convoy braked. Elena assessed the layout in the time it took her to get out of the SUV and approach the site coordinator, a first lieutenant named Garvey, who looked like he was managing about 7 things simultaneously and had been waiting for reinforcement. "What's your count?" she said. 28 accounted for, 2 still being pulled from Vehicle 1, the submersion vehicle. He was using a tablet with a running tally. 8 confirmed injuries, 3 of those critical. Base Clinic has 3 already transported. We've got 5 still on site needing assessment or stabilization. Anyone in the water? 2 were, both out. 1 has airway issues, that's your most critical. He was under for approximately 4 minutes before recovery. She was already moving toward the tent the medics had erected on the flat ground beside the road. The near-drowning patient was a 22-year-old private named Torres. I was conscious, which was both good news and incomplete news. Consciousness after a 4-minute submersion meant the hypoxic window had not been catastrophic, but it did not mean there was no damage, and the airway presentation she found when she reached him was worse than the medic's brief had communicated. He was breathing, but the work of breathing was visible. Accessory muscles engaging, the faint wheeze of upper airway inflammation, his oxygen saturation reading at 88 on the portable pulse oximeter. She crouched beside him. "Torres," she said. "I'm Ward. I'm a nurse from Halverson. Can you tell me where you hurt?" "Chest," he said. It came out effortful. "Burns." "Did you swallow water?" "Some." "Did you lose consciousness in the water?" Maybe. I don't know." She checked his pupils, checked his neck for deviation, listened to his chest with the stethoscope from her bag. Left lung was diminished. Not absent, diminished. Consistent with aspiration and secondary bronchospasm, possibly early pulmonary edema. "I need albuterol and I need it nebulized," she said to the medic beside her. "And I need supplemental oxygen at 15 liters. Do you have both?" "Yes, ma'am." "Set it up." She was already checking Torres's secondary injuries. His right forearm had a fracture she could feel without imaging, displaced enough to be concerned about vascular compromise. She checked the radial pulse. Present, but weak. "And I need a splint for the right forearm. Vascular compromise risk." The medic moved. Elena stayed with Torres, her hand on his wrist, monitoring the pulse while the oxygen was being established. "Are you with me?" she said. "Yeah," Torres said. "Yeah, Is it bad?" "Your lung aspirated some water. We're treating it." She said it plainly, without softening, because she had found over the years that most people handled clear information better than careful information. "You're going to need imaging when we transport, but your vitals are moving in the right direction." "Okay," he said. He sounded like he was deciding to believe her, which was not nothing. She had learned that patients who decided to believe the person treating them often did marginally better than patients who didn't, and the margin in early respiratory distress was not something to leave on the table. The nebulizer went on. Oxygen established. She splinted the forearm herself, checking the radial pulse before and after. The pulse improved with the splint in position. Vascular compromise from displacement reduced, which was the right result. She moved to the next patient. The next 2 hours were the kind that Elena had structured her entire professional identity around. The methodical, unglamorous, technically demanding work of keeping damaged human beings stable in conditions that were less than ideal, with equipment that was adequate but not optimal, in the dark that was arriving as the evening progressed, and the portable lights they'd set up became the primary illumination. She managed 5 patients in that time. 3 of the 8 had already been transported by the time she finished the on-site stabilization of the remaining 5. And when the last transport ambulance loaded and she stood up from her last assessment and stretched her back, the site coordinator Garvey appeared beside her with a water bottle. "Here," he said. She took it. She drank half of it without stopping. "Torres is going to make it," Garvey said. It was not a question. "His lungs should clear with treatment," she said. "He'll need a week of monitoring and the fracture needs proper fixation. But yes, you stabilized the forearm vascular compromise on site." It needed doing. Garvey looked at her for a moment. He was young, late 20s probably, with the specific quality of someone who has been doing a hard job long enough to have stopped being impressed by most things. He was impressed by this. I heard about Halverson, he said. About the review. About you. She handed back the water bottle. Is that relevant right now? No, he said. I wanted to say something. You don't have to. I know. He held the water bottle. My CO was at Kassala, not in your unit, adjacent. He talked about Ghost Actual like it was a story you told to make people understand what was possible. He paused. And then I show up tonight and the person they send me is, I just wanted to say something. Elena looked at him for a moment. Not with discomfort, the way she'd been looking at acknowledgement for years. With distance and deflection, and the careful management of other people's attempts to give her something she didn't know how to receive. She looked at him differently tonight. Tell your CO the record was corrected, she said. He knows, Garvey said. He saw the article this morning. She nodded. The last ambulance was pulling out. The scene was winding down. Flood management crew arriving to assess the bridge section, base security establishing a perimeter, the remaining vehicles being cataloged for recovery. The portable lights made the whole scene look slightly surreal, the way emergency lighting always does. Too bright in specific places, deep shadow everywhere else. Elena picked up her field bag. Need a ride back, Garvey said. The same vehicle that brought me, she said. She found Corporal Huang where she'd left him, leaning against the SUV, apparently having spent the last 2 hours in the specific patient waiting that drivers develop when their job is to deliver people to emergencies and then wait outside them. He straightened when he saw her. Ready? He said. Yes, she said. She got in the back. He drove. This time, on the way back, she let herself be tired. She didn't run calculations or review decisions or think about what she could have done differently, because she had checked the work, and the work was sound, and the rest could be assessed formally tomorrow in the documentation. She just sat in the back of the government SUV and watched Delvane scroll past the window and let the tiredness be there without fighting it. The Delvane Courier Herald's full feature piece ran 3 days later. Mira Das had done her homework. The piece was 2,200 words sourced to Okafor's office, to Colonel Merritt, to 4 members of the Halverson nursing staff who agreed to speak on record, and to 2 veterans of the Kelman adjacent operations who offered corroboration of the broader service record context. It named Marcus Vale because the State Medical Board referral had become a matter of public record by then. It named Aldous Karras because the board's findings on his authorization of the retaliatory performance action were documented and the documentation was obtainable. It named Elena Ward, not as Ghost Actual, not as Captain Elena Vasquez, as Elena Ward, RN, Halverson Military Medical Center, whose service record had been altered and who had spent 4 months being systematically dismissed in a facility that needed what she had. The piece did something that journalism sometimes manages to do when the reporting is patient and the facts are organized correctly. It told the story in a way that made the institutional failure clear without requiring any single person to be a cartoon villain. Vale's decisions were documented. Karras's decisions were documented. The 2 Army officers who had altered the after-action report were identified by name for the first time in print. The anomaly in the original documentation, the 18 months of IG inquiry, the corrected record, all of it laid out in sequence. And then the bridge convoy incident, which Doss had learned about and confirmed through base public affairs, was included at the end. A brief paragraph noting that the same nurse who had been removed from trauma authority consideration at Halverson 3 weeks ago had been the senior clinician called to the Kelman Access Road site, had managed 5 casualties including a near drowning with vascular complication, and had done so on 2 hours of notice after a full hospital shift. The paragraph was 4 sentences. It did not need to be longer. Marcus Vale's medical board hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the federal review closed. Elena did not attend. She was not required to attend. Her documentation had already been submitted, the clinical record, the medication error catch, the pattern of performance notes that the board's investigator had characterized in their preliminary assessment as a systematic effort to undermine a colleague's professional standing using patient safety infrastructure as a mechanism, which was the formal language for what Elena had known from the first week. She heard about the hearing date from Petra, who heard about it from the hospital's legal coordinator, who mentioned it in passing. He's not denying it, Petra said. His attorney is arguing context. That he was operating under stress and didn't intend the documentation to function as... She stopped. I don't know the specific language. It doesn't matter what he intended, Elena said. It matters what it did. His attorney says he's a good doctor who made poor administrative decisions. He is a good doctor, Elena said. It was a more complicated sentence than it sounded, and Petra received it as such. And he made choices with consequences. Both those things can be true. Petra looked at her. You don't want him destroyed. I want the system to function correctly, Elena said, which means consequences proportionate to what was done and accountability that prevents it happening to someone else. That's what I want. What happens to him individually? She considered. He'll carry it. That's enough. The board suspended Vale's hospital privileges for 18 months, mandated ethics training and supervised practice review, and entered the findings into the permanent licensing record. The suspension meant he would need to complete a reinstatement process with independent clinical evaluation before returning to trauma surgery. It was not the end of his career. It was a significant, documented public consequence that would affect how he practiced and where he practiced for the remainder of it. It was proportionate. Elena had no further opinion to offer. Aldous Karras resigned from his position as department director 7 weeks after the federal review. The board had stopped short of recommending termination, finding instead that his conduct represented a failure of administrative judgment that, while influenced by incomplete information, did not meet the standard required for continued leadership of this department. He accepted that finding and resigned rather than wait for a forced transition. He wrote Elena a letter, not an email, an actual letter, that was 3 paragraphs long and did not ask for forgiveness, and did not explain itself further than what he'd already said in the office. It acknowledged, simply and without performance, that he had failed to do what a director was supposed to do, which was to protect the people under his authority from exactly the kind of pressure he had allowed to operate unchecked. She read it twice. She put it in the same drawer as the commendation. The interim trauma department lead position became official in the 8th week. Elena accepted it on a Tuesday afternoon after a conversation with the new interim director, a woman named Constance Barr, who had been brought in from the Army Medical Command and who spoke to Elena for 45 minutes before offering the role formally, in the manner of someone who had already decided but was thorough enough to verify the decision against the actual human being in the room. You understand this isn't permanent, Barr said. It's a bridge role while the department restructures. I understand. And you understand that it comes with administrative responsibility you may find less satisfying than clinical work. I understand that too. Then why take it? Elena thought about the question, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer deserved to be said carefully. Because the department needs someone who will build it around the patients instead of around the hierarchy, she said. And because I've been doing this work long enough to know what it looks like when an institution has been allowed to prioritize its internal comfort over its actual function. I want to be part of correcting that. She paused. And because if I don't, someone else will get the role who might not prioritize it that way. Barr looked at her. That's a practical answer. I'm a practical person. The staff you'd be leading includes people who made my first 4 months here difficult, Elena said. Yes, I'm aware. Some of them have changed, some haven't yet. That's what leadership is for. Barr nodded. She extended her hand. Elena shook it. She told Dario first, which she hadn't planned. It just happened, because he was the first person she encountered after leaving Barr's office, and the news was too present to contain, which was unusual for Elena, and she recognized that about herself in that moment. They offered me interim lead, she said. He stopped walking. And? I took it. He looked at her for a long moment. His face did the thing that faces do when a person is experiencing something they don't quite have vocabulary for and are trying to find it in real time. Okay, he said finally. Okay. You sound surprised. I'm not surprised you took it. I'm surprised you're telling me before you tell anyone else. She considered that. You earned it, she said. He looked away for a moment, out the corridor window, at the pale Delvane sky. When he looked back, his expression had settled into something quiet and real. You know what I thought when I first saw you set up that secondary station? He said. Before the activation, when you were pulling supplies before anyone had asked you to. What? I thought, That's someone who's been in situations where not being ready was the last mistake you made. He paused. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but I knew it. She looked at him. That's why you helped me set it up, she said. Yeah. She nodded. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the silence was the comfortable kind. The kind that happens between people who have been through something together and don't need to keep describing it. Friday teach session, she said. The tension pneumo presentation. I'm doing it. His face changed in the way faces change when something long anticipated arrives. Good, he said. She went back to her patients. Harlan Oates was discharged on a Thursday morning, 8 days after the helicopter went down. Elena was on shift. She stopped by his room before the paperwork was finalized, which she had been doing as a routine part of her rounds and which she would have done regardless of history. He was dressed, actual clothes, not a hospital gown, sitting on the edge of the bed looking like a person who had been returned to himself after a period of involuntary suspension. Your rhythm's been stable for 4 days, she said. The ortho clearance came through this morning. I know, he said. I read my own chart. Patients aren't supposed to access their charts without, I'm aware. He looked entirely unrepentant. She checked the final vitals on the tablet, signed the discharge confirmation. Your sister came, she said. He had called, as instructed. She drove 14 hours, he said. Slightly excessive. She's your emergency contact. I told her it was fine. You had a cardiac event and a vascular complication. I know what I had. He paused. She's in the cafeteria right now. I made her go get food because she's been in this room for 3 days and it was becoming... He exhaled. She worries. That's what sisters do, Elena said. She capped the stylus on the tablet. He looked at her. What Okafor is setting up. The field medicine curriculum. Merritt mentioned it again when he called me last week. He's still calling you? He checks in. Harlan considered. He's doing the thing people do when they owe a debt and can't fully pay it. The calling is part of it. Elena said nothing. He said you haven't formally committed to the curriculum development. I'm in an interim department lead role, she said. I have enough. He said you'd say that. Harlan looked at her steadily. He also said the curriculum would be named in your service designation, the real name, Vasquez Protocols, or something to that effect. She looked at him. The name she had left behind in a Stuttgart debrief room, in a building in a country she'd needed to put an ocean between herself and for a while. The name that was on the commendation in her drawer. The name that belonged to the person who had made the decisions in the dark in Kassala, and had then spent years living in the aftermath of those decisions without institutional acknowledgement of what they'd cost. That's a decision for later, she said. Okay, he said. She moved toward the door. Ward, he said. She looked back. He had the look on his face that he'd had the first night in the trauma bay when he'd grabbed her wrist and said the call sign. That particular intensity of someone recognizing something important, but without the delirium this time, without the low blood pressure and the adrenaline, just clear-eyed and deliberate. I told my sister about you, he said. Not everything, the parts I could say. He paused. She wanted to know what you were like. I didn't know how to answer. What did you tell her? He considered it. I told her you were the kind of person who does the thing that needs doing before anyone else has figured out it needs doing, and then goes back to work like it didn't happen. He paused. She said that sounded lonely. The word landed. Not like a wound, more like something true said aloud that had previously only existed as a shape inside her she'd been navigating around. It has been, she said. Sometimes. He nodded. Not with pity. With the acknowledgement of one person who has carried something difficult for a long time to another person who has done the same. Get out of here, she said. Your sister's in the cafeteria. He got up. She held the door. He walked out, and he walked correctly, without the hitch she'd first observed when his orthopedic exam was still pending, and that was good. That was what the work was for. The Friday teach session ran long. 15 residents, 3 interns, 2 of the nursing staff who'd asked to sit in, and Dr. Yara Obeng at the back of the room with a notebook she actually used. Elena ran it for 90 minutes, 40 of content, 50 of questions, because the questions were better than the content, and she was experienced enough to follow the questions where they went. The tension pneumo presentation was only the first 20 minutes. After that, it expanded into field assessment methodology under degraded conditions, low light, limited equipment, noise interference, and the specific gap between textbook differential diagnosis and the pattern recognition that develops when you have done a procedure enough times, under enough different conditions, that your hands know things your verbal reasoning hasn't finished processing. That was the hardest part to teach. She was honest about that. I can give you the visual checklist, she said. I can walk you through the tactile component. What I can't give you in a room is the specific quality of attention that develops when the consequences of missing something are immediate and irreversible. That takes time, and it takes exposure, and it takes doing the work in conditions that are uncomfortable. She looked at the room. What I can tell you is that it's possible to develop. I've seen it happen. It requires deciding that the patient in front of you is always more important than your certainty, which means staying curious even when you're confident, especially when you're confident. One of the residents raised her hand. Is that how you caught the pneumo on patient 4 during the activation last month? The one in the overnight incident report? Elena looked at her. That's a specific question. I read the report, the resident said. The sequence of the assessment was, the speed of it was... The speed came from pattern recognition, Elena said. And pattern recognition came from having seen it before in worse conditions and having that experience become automatic. She paused. The goal is to make the right response automatic. Not fast, automatic. Speed is a consequence of automaticity, not the thing you practice. The room was quiet. In the way rooms go quiet, when a room full of people has just received something they're going to carry with them. Obeng wrote something in her notebook. 6 weeks after the teach session, the Army Medical Department's Field Medicine Integration Office sent Elena a formal proposal for the curriculum development, a 12-month project structured as an adjunct to her Halverson role, with a dedicated research assistant and collaboration access to Army medical records and field operation documentation. The curriculum would be named the Vasquez Field Assessment Protocols. She sat with the proposal for 3 days. On the third day, she went to the drawer beside her table and took out the commendation. She read the citation again. The fourth time she had read it, all told. Then she folded it and put it back. She thought about what Harlan's sister had said, that it sounded lonely. She thought about Dario filing the complaint without telling her, about Corporal Huang handing her water at the bridge site, about Petra standing in the supply room saying the word sorry without decorating it into something more comfortable than it needed to be. About Merritt in the corridor saying, I chose the promotion with the directness of someone who had finally run out of reasons to be indirect. She thought about the 14 people in Kassala and the 7 from the helicopter crash, and Torres with his compromised forearm and his 88% oxygen saturation improving in real time, and the 1,000 small recoveries and catches and near misses of 4 months in a trauma department that had tried to push her out and had instead been changed by her presence. She thought about what it cost to do this work and what it was worth, and whether those two things had to be in conflict forever. They didn't, she decided. Not entirely. The cost was real, and it was permanent, and it would not be undone by a commendation or a curriculum or a job title. The years she had spent carrying the unacknowledged weight of Kassala were years she did not get back. The 6-year gap in her service record, the false listing of missing presumed killed, the quiet institutional decision to reduce her to a footnote rather than acknowledge what she had actually done. That damage was real and had shaped the person she became, and she would not pretend otherwise. But the person she became was here, was still standing in a trauma department in Delvane, still catching what other people missed, still moving to the station before anyone thought to ask. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole point. She accepted the curriculum proposal on a Thursday morning by email, in language that was direct and specific about what she would need to make it work. She CC'd Barr and Okafor and sent a separate note to Merritt, 3 sentences, that said, I'm doing it. Make sure the methodology documentation is complete before I start. And get some sleep. You sound tired on the phone. He responded in 11 minutes. Understood. Working on it. How do you know I sound tired? She didn't respond to that. He knew the answer. She was in the trauma bay on a Tuesday evening in the 5th month of her interim lead role when the last piece resolved. The call came from the Army Medical Department's Records Division, a routine confirmation that the corrected service file for Captain Elena Marin Vasquez had been finalized, archived, and cross-referenced with the civilian personnel record for Elena Ward, creating a unified record that was accurate, complete, and accessible for the first time. The woman on the phone read her a confirmation number and asked if she had any questions. "No," Elena said. "Thank you." She hung up. She was standing at the nurse's station, mid-shift, with 3 patient charts open on the screen in front of her, and the steady background sounds of the trauma bay doing its work. Monitors, ventilators, the voices of staff moving between stations, with the particular calibrated urgency of a department that had learned to function better than it had before. She looked at the charts. She looked at the bay. She thought, this is the thing they try to take from you when they dismiss you. Not your competence. They can't take that. Not your record. That turned out to be recoverable. They try to take the story you tell yourself about what you're worth, and what your work means, and whether the gap between what you know you are and what they're willing to acknowledge constitutes evidence that you were wrong about yourself. She had not been wrong. She had known that, imperfectly and without external validation, through 4 months of dismissal and performance notes, and a reassignment that was meant to reduce her to something manageable. She had known it through 6 years of civilian nursing and the years before that in the field. She had known it in the way that knowledge lives when there's nowhere comfortable to put it, not as confidence exactly, not as pride, but as something more fundamental and more stubborn, as the simple factual understanding that she knew what she was doing and she was going to keep doing it, regardless of whether the institution around her had the capacity to recognize it. That had not been easy. She was not going to pretend it had been easy, or that the quiet had been comfortable, or that she had been untouched by the months of being treated as insufficient. People who tell you that the dismissal doesn't get to you are usually people who haven't been dismissed properly. It gets to you. You carry it in your jaw, in the way you sleep, in the specific energy it takes to keep doing good work when the environment is telling you the work doesn't matter. What she had learned, what Casala had taught her, and Halverson had reinforced in a different key, was that the work mattered whether or not anyone was acknowledging it. The patients were real. The interventions were real. The 14 people in that FOB were real. Torres's improving oxygen saturation was real. You could take the acknowledgement away entirely, and the reality of the work didn't change. That was not an invitation to accept mistreatment. She wanted to be clear about that, in her own mind, because there was a version of this lesson that could be twisted into something harmful, the version that tells you to be quiet and keep working and not make trouble, that the work should be its own reward. That version was wrong. What had happened at Halverson was wrong. What had been done to her service record was wrong. Allowing it to continue would have been wrong, and she had not been the one who raised the alarm. Dario had, Kyle Moran had, Oates had, at 4 a.m. from a hospital bed. But she had answered when called and given testimony and not minimized what had been done, because minimizing it would have made the next version of it easier. The lesson was not be quiet. The lesson was harder and more specific. Know who you are with enough certainty that the institution's opinion of you does not become your opinion of yourself. Then do the work. Then let the record accumulate. Then, when the machinery finally catches up, because sometimes it does, not always, not for everyone, but sometimes, be present for that too. Don't disappear. She had not disappeared. She had stayed in the room. The monitor on Bay 3 sounded a brief alert, a minor arrhythmia on a post-surgical patient that resolved itself within 8 seconds, not requiring intervention, but requiring documentation. Elena noted the time, updated the chart, flagged it for the attending's morning review. The bay settled back into its rhythm. Dario appeared at the station with a patient update, delivered it efficiently, moved on. Petra was running the step-down census at the adjacent station, doing the work she was good at. The second-year resident who had been nervous about the wound irrigation 3 months ago was now managing a moderately complex laceration in Bay 2, with the focused, careful attention of someone who has crossed the line between learning and knowing. Elena watched him for a moment. She thought about Barr's curriculum proposal, about the Vasquez field assessment protocols, and what they could do in the hands of physicians and nurses who had the training but had never been forced to translate it under pressure. About the residents in that Friday session who had gone quiet when she said the right response has to become automatic. About everything she had built in her body over years of imperfect, costly, essential work that could now be passed forward. That was the thing that had shifted, somewhere in the last 2 months. She had come to Halverson to disappear into the work and be left alone. That had been the plan. The quiet plan. The small plan. The plan of someone who had been carrying too much for too long and thought that shrinking was the same thing as resting. It wasn't. She didn't want to be small anymore. Not because she had anything to prove. She had understood for a long time that she had nothing to prove, and Halverson had confirmed it in the hardest way possible. But because small meant the knowledge stayed with her, and the knowledge was too important to stay with only her. The trauma bay continued its work. Elena Ward picked up the next chart. The 5 marks on her forearm, covered by her sleeve, were what they had always been. Not symbols of suffering, not decorations, not the evidence of her value. Just marks. The physical residue of specific moments in which she had been hurt, and had continued anyway, and which she had chosen to carry visibly on her own body as a reminder that survival is not the end of the story. It is, in fact, just where the next part begins. And she had a lot of work left to do.